The sky was a dull gray when I pulled off the highway onto the winding dirt road that led to the cabin. It was October 2003, early autumn, and I had taken a week off work to get away from the city. I was 28, living alone in Seattle, and desperate for a break from the noise, the rush, the constant hum of life that left me exhausted but restless. The cabin was a rental, deep in the woods of northern Oregon, about a 2-hour drive from Portland. I had found it online, an old wooden structure sitting on the edge of a thick forest, near a small, quiet lake. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the smell. It was a mix of wet wood, damp earth, and something faintly like smoke, like the cabin had been closed up for a long time and was only now waking up. The dirt road ended in a small clearing where the cabin stood, surrounded by tall pines whose tops disappeared into a thick fog that had rolled in overnight. The cabin itself was rough but sturdy, built maybe in the 70s, with peeling brown paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dusty, clouded with grime and spiderwebs. I parked my car next to the porch and grabbed my backpack and cooler. The air was cold, the kind that creeps through your jacket and makes you aware of every small breath you take. Inside, the cabin smelled of stale air and old wood. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls were lined with wood paneling that had yellowed with age. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a worn-out table with 2 chairs, and a living space with a threadbare couch and a fireplace full of cold ashes. I dropped my bags and went to the windows, looking out into the forest. The fog had thickened, blurring the trees and hiding the lake from view. The cabin had no cell signal, no internet, and no TV, exactly what I wanted. I was here to disconnect, to find some peace. After unpacking my things, I went to explore the surroundings. A narrow path led from the back of the cabin down to the lake. The water was still, dark, and cold-looking. Leaves floated on its surface, and the air was so quiet I could hear the faint splash of a fish breaking the water far away. I spent the day unpacking, chopping some wood for the fireplace, and trying to get comfortable. The cabin was simple but had what I needed: a bed, a small bathroom with a shower, and a wood stove to heat the place if it got too cold at night. As evening came, the fog grew thicker and crept closer to the cabin. I lit the stove, filling the room with a faint smell of smoke and warmth. Outside, the woods were alive with sounds: rustling leaves, distant birds, the occasional snap of a twig. It was calming but also made me aware of how isolated I was. No other houses, no people, nothing but trees stretching for miles. I cooked some canned soup on the stove and ate quietly by the window. The light inside the cabin was dim, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the fog seemed to press against the glass, softening the edges of the trees and hiding the world beyond. That night, I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds outside. The wind whispered through the branches, and at one point, I heard a low, distant howl, maybe a coyote or a wolf. It wasn't frightening, just a reminder of the wildness surrounding me. I fell asleep with the stove warming the room and the fog wrapping the cabin like a blanket. The next day was clear, bright with sunlight piercing through the trees. I decided to hike deeper into the forest, taking the path that followed the edge of the lake. The trail was narrow, lined with ferns and moss-covered rocks, and the ground was soft underfoot. I saw deer tracks in the mud and the occasional squirrel darting through the branches. I carried a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and a map I had printed before coming. The map wasn't very detailed, but showed the main paths and a few landmarks, including an old logging road not far from the cabin. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Old, rusted metal objects half buried in the dirt. Fragments of wire, parts of machinery, and broken glass. It looked like someone had been here years ago, maybe for logging or mining. The forest was reclaiming it all, but the signs of human activity were faint but there. After a couple of hours, I reached a clearing with an old foundation made of large stones, maybe the remains of a cabin or small building. The wood was long gone, but nails and bits of broken glass were scattered around. I walked through carefully, noticing how the area was overgrown with weeds and vines. The silence here was heavier, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't stay long and headed back before the sun got too low. When I got back to the cabin, the fog had returned, thicker than before. The woods looked darker, the trees more like black shadows. I lit the stove again and tried to relax with a book, but my thoughts kept drifting. That night, I heard something outside. It wasn't the usual forest noises. It was a faint, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled over the ground. It was slow and deliberate. I stayed still, listening, but I couldn't see anything through the window except the dense fog. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and the forest went silent again. I told myself it was probably a fallen branch or an animal moving through the undergrowth. Still, it made me a little uneasy. The next morning, I found marks outside near the edge of the clearing, deep grooves in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged across the ground. They led into the forest, disappearing between the trees. The grooves were fresh. The earth was still loose. I spent the day checking the perimeter, but I didn't see any other signs. The forest was quiet, and the cabin looked the same, but the feeling of being watched was growing. I kept the windows closed tight and kept a small hatchet near the door. The third night was worse. The dragging sound returned, louder this time, closer. It circled the cabin slowly, stopping sometimes, then moving again. I didn't dare open the door or look outside. I stayed huddled near the stove, the hatchet in my hand, the cabin dark except for the small orange glow. At one point, the dragging stopped just outside the door. I could hear heavy breathing, low and slow. My heart pounded. After a long silence, the sound moved away, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I noticed the back door had a long scratch mark, like claws trying to tear through the wood. The scratches were deep, jagged, and fresh. There was dirt and some hair stuck in the marks, coarse, dark, not human. Fear hit me hard, but I stayed calm. I knew the cabin was isolated, but it had a door and windows. I checked my supplies and decided I needed to get out the next day. That afternoon, I made sure the car was ready, packed everything, and prepared for the drive back. I wanted to leave before nightfall. As evening came, the fog was almost thick enough to cut with a knife. The sounds outside were different now, low growls, rustling that was faster and more purposeful. I sat near the window, watching the dark forest, waiting for the last light. Then I heard it, a deep growl, low and long, coming from just beyond the porch. I grabbed the hatchet and slowly stepped outside, the cold air biting my skin. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the mist. Suddenly, movement caught my eye, two glowing eyes staring at me from the edge of the clearing. The creature was large, much bigger than any dog or wolf I had seen. Its fur was matted, dark, and wet, and its teeth glinted in the dim light. I backed toward the cabin, heart racing. The animal didn't move but growled again, low and threatening. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I could hear it pacing outside, its heavy breathing and low growls pressing against the wood. I turned on the porch light, hoping to scare it away, but the creature just stopped and stared, unmoved. Night fell fully, and the cabin felt like a small island in a sea of danger. I stayed by the window, watching the shadows move, ready to defend myself. Morning came with a thin, weak sun. The creature was gone, but outside the porch were deep paw prints, big and muddy. I wasted no time. I packed the last things, started the car, and drove away, not looking back. The road was long and winding, but the feeling of relief grew with every mile. The forest stayed behind me, dense and silent. When I got home, I called the rental company and told them about what happened. They said the area was known for a large population of wild bears, and sometimes one or two got bold enough to come near cabins. Looking back, I realized the dragging sounds, the scratches, the growls. It was a bear, maybe a big male, territorial and desperate for food before winter. It wasn't a ghost or a myth. It was nature, wild and real, and I had been lucky to get away safe. The experience taught me how quickly the wilderness could turn from peaceful to dangerous. I still think about that cabin, the quiet lake, and the foggy nights, but now I know respect for the forest means knowing what lives there. not just in stories, but in real life. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to take a break from work and spend some time in the woods. I was 34 then, single, working as a freelance graphic designer in Chicago. I had been burned out from nonstop deadlines and screen time. A friend had told me about this quiet area in northern Minnesota, somewhere near Eerie, where he used to go fishing as a kid. There was a cabin there his uncle once owned, but it had been empty for years. He said it was old, no electricity, no running water, but still solid. I could use it for free if I wanted. It sounded perfect to me. I packed up my old SUV with what I thought I'd need. A couple coolers of food, a camping stove, sleeping bag, lanterns, batteries, clothes for cold weather, and some books. I also brought a hatchet and a folding saw in case I needed to chop firewood. It was supposed to be cold that week, dropping into the 30s at night. I printed directions and loaded my phone with maps in case I lost signal, which I expected to happen once I was deep into the woods. The drive was long, nearly 10 hours from the city. The further north I went, the more remote things got. Gas stations became rare. Towns got smaller. By the time I passed through Ely, the last town on the route, it was early afternoon. The road turned to gravel not long after, winding through thick pine and birch forest. I followed the directions carefully. At one point, I had to leave the main road entirely and follow an unmarked dirt trail. It was barely wide enough for my vehicle, and the trees scratched against the sides of the car as I crept along. Eventually, I came to a clearing where the cabin sat just like he'd described. It was old, with gray, weather-beaten wood and a sagging metal roof. The windows were covered in grime, but intact. The door stuck when I tried to open it, but I shoved it hard and it gave. Inside, it was one room with a small wood stove, a dusty old cot, some shelves, and a table with 2 chairs. Rodent droppings were in the corners, and there was a musky smell, but it was solid and dry. I opened all the windows to air it out. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning. I swept out the dirt and leaves, knocked down cobwebs, and wiped off the surfaces. I checked for leaks or rot and didn't see any. There was a pile of chopped wood outside, dry under a makeshift lean-to. I brought some in and lit a fire in the stove before the sun went down. It got dark fast out there. There was no light pollution, just blackness beyond the windows and the sound of wind moving through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I read by lantern light until I got tired, then crawled into my sleeping bag on the cot. The silence was overwhelming. In the city, there's always some background noise, cars, sirens, people. Here, it was just the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I drifted off after a while, but woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange sound. It was like a slow dragging or scraping noise coming from outside. I sat up and listened. It stopped. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer walking through the brush. After a few minutes, I laid back down and forced myself to sleep. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading away from the clearing, barely visible under the fallen leaves. I followed it for a while and found a small frozen-over pond about half a mile in. There were no footprints or signs of people, just quiet woods and the sound of distant birds. Felt peaceful. That afternoon, I collected more wood, boiled water from a nearby stream for drinking, and cooked a simple meal on the camping stove. I had brought a small solar battery for my phone, but I kept it off most of the time to conserve power. There was no signal anyway. I read a bit, jotted down some sketches, and sat outside with a blanket wrapped around me until it got too cold. Again, I built up the fire before bed. That second night, I heard the noise again, scraping, slow, like something being dragged across the ground. It came from the left side of the cabin this time. I turned off the lantern and stood by the window, peeking through a small gap in the curtain. I couldn't see anything. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound stopped again after a few minutes. I told myself it had to be a raccoon or porcupine. Maybe a branch had fallen. But I noticed something in the morning, tracks. Not paw prints, but drag marks. 2 of them parallel, starting at the tree line and ending near the cabin wall. Then they just stopped. I went out to look closer. The ground was covered in leaves, but I could tell something had been pulled or dragged through them. I looked around but didn't find anything. No animal, no object, no broken branches. I brushed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The third night, I decided to stay up late and keep watch. I sat by the window with the lantern turned low, wrapped in a blanket, listening. For hours, nothing happened. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. That dragging sound, slow and steady, from the back side of the cabin. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the back door quietly. I stepped out onto the cold porch, heart pounding. I moved the light slowly across the trees. Nothing. I walked a few steps toward the woods. Still nothing. But the dragging had stopped the moment I opened the door. I stood there for a long time, just listening. Eventually, I went back inside. When I woke up in the morning, there were new drag marks on the other side of the cabin. Same parallel lines, same end point. It was like someone or something was circling the place at night. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to. I hadn't seen anything. Could still be an animal. Maybe a bear dragging a carcass. Maybe an old trap or cable had gotten pulled by wind. I didn't want to panic over nothing. That day, I explored further down the trail near the pond. I figured it would help clear my head. The sky was overcast and the air felt damp. After about a mile, I found something I hadn't seen before. A second cabin, older and smaller than mine. It was half collapsed, covered in vines and moss. The door hung open, and one wall had caved in. It looked abandoned for decades. Inside, there were rusted tools, broken furniture, and a shattered mirror. Something about it felt off. The place was hidden, like someone had built it to disappear. I didn't stay long. On the way back, I kept looking over my shoulder. That night, I placed small sticks upright around the cabin walls, spaced out in a circle. If anything came close, it would knock them over. I also brought the hatchet inside and kept it next to the cot. The fire burned hot, but I didn't sleep much. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the dragging again. I held my breath and listened. This time, it moved around the cabin slowly, like something circling deliberately. After about 20 minutes, it stopped. I didn't dare go outside. In the morning, some of the sticks were knocked over on the east side. The drag marks were there again. And this time, I noticed something else. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly next to the wall, like someone had left them there intentionally. That was it. I decided I was leaving the next morning. I spent the rest of that day packing up. I left the place as clean as I could. I tried not to think about the other cabin, or the noises, or the drag marks. That night, I kept the fire going and stayed fully dressed in case I had to leave suddenly. I barely slept. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the wall. Not scratching or dragging, tapping. Rhythmic like a knock. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then again. I sat up and listened, too afraid to move. Then silence. I stayed like that until sunrise. When it was light enough, I loaded the last of my things into the car and left. The road out felt narrower than before. Every sound in the woods made me flinch. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, and even then I didn't breathe easy until I reached Eerie. Back in Chicago, I tried to make sense of what happened. I looked at maps, tried to find that second cabin on satellite view, but nothing showed up. I didn't tell anyone about the drag marks or the knocks. I just said the place was too remote and I needed a hot shower. It's been years now, and I still think about that trip. I still don't know what was out there. Maybe it was a person living off-grid. Maybe it was a hunter or some reclusive squatter. But it wasn't random. The drag marks, the sticks, the rocks, they were placed on purpose. Someone was watching the cabin at night. Maybe they were trying to scare me off. If that was their goal, it worked. I've never gone back, and I don't plan to. I still love the woods, but I stick to campgrounds now. Places with other people around, lights, even security cameras. I learned something out there in Minnesota. The scariest things aren't always loud or violent. Sometimes, it's what stays quiet, just outside the window, waiting for you to fall asleep. I wasn't the kind of person who usually went out to the woods alone. My friends often joked about my nervousness when it came to being in the middle of nowhere, but after weeks of pressure from them, I finally agreed to spend a weekend alone in a cabin in the woods. It seemed harmless enough, a quiet break away from work, a little peace and solitude. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, off the grid, just the way the owners liked it. It sounded like an escape, and at first, that's all I wanted. I had just turned 29. I had a decent job, a few friends, and a lot of stress that needed to be shaken off. It was late October, just before the snow would start to fall, and the chill in the air had already begun. My car pulled into the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, its tires crunching over the dry, brittle leaves. Trees lined both sides of the road, their trunks dark and twisted, reaching up into the sky like skeletal hands. A cold wind rustled through the branches, sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, feeling a little uneasy, but that was normal, right? I'd rented the cabin through a small, local agency. The ad had been vague, only offering the basics: a small, one-bedroom cabin with a fireplace, a view of a nearby lake, and no other houses for miles. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace. The perfect retreat. As I parked and grabbed my bags from the back of the car, I noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that seems almost unnatural. The kind that makes you realize how much noise is around you all the time, even when you're not paying attention. There were no birds chirping, no sounds of traffic, just an almost suffocating silence. I locked the car, grabbed the key from under the mat, and made my way to the front door of the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the wood cold under my hand. Inside, the place was exactly as I'd expected, rustic but comfortable. A large stone fireplace sat in the center of the living room, with a small couch and a few wooden chairs scattered around. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, and the scent of pine and old wood filled the air. The windows overlooked a small, mist-covered lake, the surface of the water smooth and glassy, reflecting the gray sky above. A chill seemed to settle in the room as I took a deep breath. This place was going to be great, I thought, just what I needed. I unpacked my bags and started a fire in the hearth. The flames flickered and crackled as I sat down in the armchair, settling in for a night of reading and relaxation. The hours passed slowly, and by the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the only light in the cabin came from the fire and a single dim lamp near the door. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear the branches scratching against the walls of the cabin, making the house feel even more isolated. Around midnight, I heard a noise, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft, unsettling sound, but it was enough to make me pause. I sat up straight, listening carefully. The fire popped and crackled in the hearth, the only other sound in the room. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing else. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought, or maybe an animal outside. I shrugged it off and went back to my book, but the uneasy feeling lingered. An hour later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, closer, like something was definitely moving outside. The sound was slow, deliberate, like footsteps dragging through the leaves. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The mist had thickened, and the lake was barely visible now, shrouded in fog. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with the weight of the wind. I didn't see anything moving, but the sense of being watched crept up my spine. I backed away from the window and walked over to the door. It was locked, the deadbolt securely in place. I could feel my pulse quickening as the silence settled in again. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or some other animal had wandered too close to the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to check the windows again, but this time, I heard a loud thud. Came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat. The thud was heavy, like something large had bumped into the side of the house. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and moved cautiously toward the back door. I shined the light through the window, scanning the dark yard behind the cabin. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, just outside the pool of light from the cabin. It was hard to make out, just a shadowy shape against the trees. But there was no mistaking the feeling of being watched. My mind raced. Was it a person? A man? I had to be imagining it, right? Maybe it was just a trick of the light or the trees playing games with my eyes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. I had come here to get away from everything, but now all I wanted was to leave. I grabbed my coat and ran for the door, but as I reached for the handle, a loud bang echoed from the back of the cabin. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone had just hit the wall. I froze. What the hell was going on? I turned, my eyes scanning the room for anything I could use as a weapon. The fireplace poker. I grabbed it and held it tight, my hand shaking. There was no way I was going outside to confront whoever or whatever was out there. The banging came again, louder this time, and I could feel the walls of the cabin shaking from the force of it. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. I moved back to the window and looked out, but there was no one there. The figure had disappeared, but the noise continued. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. The hours dragged on, but the banging didn't stop. Came in waves, each one more frantic than the last. I was trapped, my only thought now being how to survive the night. I wasn't sure if I could even make it until morning. I was 32 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the northern part of Idaho. It was July 2021, and I had just taken time off from a job I'd been grinding at for nearly 8 years without a proper break. I'd been feeling burned out and irritable all the time, and I thought being alone in the woods, away from emails and traffic and other people, might help straighten my head out. I didn't want campgrounds or RV parks or anything like that. I wanted real isolation. Just a tent, my pack, and a few days of total quiet. I found a spot on satellite maps that seemed perfect, about 15 miles off any major road, not marked with any trails. Just a small clearing next to a winding creek that eventually fed into the Salmon River. The access road wasn't even on the GPS. It was more of an old fire trail than a road, overgrown and barely wide enough for my truck. But it was manageable. I parked in a small pull-off about half a mile from where the trail vanished into the forest and loaded up my pack. It was hot and dry, and the hike in wasn't easy. I was sweating through my shirt within 10 minutes, and the bugs were bad in the thicker brush. But the woods were beautiful. Tall lodgepole pines, long stretches of dry needles underfoot, birds everywhere. The further I got from the road, the more the quiet wrapped around me like a blanket. It was the first time in years I felt like I could actually breathe. The clearing was even better than it looked on the map. Maybe 50 yards across, hemmed in by dense forest on 3 sides, and a rocky creek curving around the 4th. The sound of water was constant, clean, steady. No trash, no fire rings, no signs anyone else had camped there. Just silence and wildness. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to hear the creek but far enough not to get wet if it rained. I kept things simple: 1-person tent, sleeping pad, bag, stove, some freeze-dried meals, and a water filter. I brought a bare canister for food, and I stored it 100 feet from the tent like you're supposed to. I spent that first evening walking around, checking out the terrain, gathering deadfall wood for a fire. I wasn't planning to burn much, but the fire gave me something to look at, something to do with my hands. The temperature dropped fast once the sun dipped behind the trees. I sat beside the fire, listening to the insects hum in the trees and watching shadows creep slowly across the clearing. When it got too dark to see my hand in front of my face, I crawled into the tent and lay back on my bag, letting my mind empty out. That first night was peaceful. I woke up once to pee, and the stars were so bright it looked fake. No clouds, no moon. Just black sky and cold air and 1,000 points of light over the treetops. I remember thinking it was the quietest I'd ever heard the world. The next morning, I filtered water from the creek and made instant oatmeal. I decided to follow the creek upstream for a while just to explore. I brought my day pack, a knife, a flashlight, and a few snacks. I wasn't expecting to be gone long. The creek ran uphill through a narrow gully, and I had to cross it a few times, hopping from rock to avoid getting wet. I saw elk tracks, scat, even what looked like cougar prints in the mud, though I wasn't completely sure. The sun filtered through the trees in shifting patterns, and the further I walked, the less I thought about work or my phone or any of that crap. I followed the creek maybe 2 miles before turning around. On the way back, I saw something weird. A tree, maybe 20 feet tall, stripped of all its bark on one side. The wood underneath was torn and gouged, almost like claw marks, but not clean. More like chunks had been ripped off by something. There were splinters on the ground. I bent down and looked at it, trying to figure out if it was a bear marking its territory or something else. But it looked too aggressive for that, like something had been trying to break the tree apart. There were also prints nearby, boot prints. Not mine. Someone else had been walking there recently, but they were deep, like the person was heavy or carrying something big. I suddenly felt exposed, standing there in the trees, far from camp, far from my truck. I listened, but heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement, not even birds. That silence made the hairs on my neck stand up. I made my way back to camp faster than before, checking behind me now and then. Nothing followed me. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. The tent, the fire pit, even the wood I'd gathered. Still, I felt off. Not scared, exactly, just unsettled. I kept turning around, thinking I'd see someone standing just beyond the trees. I didn't, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, I didn't make a fire. I cooked in silence, eating with my back to a tree so I could see the clearing. I didn't hear anything strange, but every little snap or rustle made me twitch. At some point, I realized the insects had gone quiet again. No crickets, no frogs, just the creak and the sound of my own breath. I went to bed early but didn't sleep much. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a noise. Not a branch falling or an animal walking. Something sharper, like metal clinking against metal. I froze, listening. Then it came again. Faint, distant, but real. A sound you don't expect in the woods. Stopped, then started again. I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could and peeked out. There was nothing in the clearing. No lights, no movement. I waited 5 minutes, then got out, barefoot, and crept toward the trees. The sound was coming from deeper in the forest, back the way I'd come earlier that day. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was regular. Tap, scrape, tap, scrape. I stood there for what felt like half an hour, not moving until it finally stopped. I didn't go back to sleep. The next day, I packed everything up. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby, watching. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was overthinking things, but I knew better. That sound wasn't an animal. It was a person doing something. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker, but something felt wrong. I loaded my gear and hiked back toward the truck. The trail looked different on the way out. Bushes bent the wrong way, branches freshly broken. At one point, I found a boot print on the trail, but it was pointing toward my camp. Not away. That was enough. I kept moving. When I got to where I'd parked, the first thing I noticed was that my truck wasn't how I'd left it. The driver's door was open just an inch. I know I locked it. I always do. I dropped my pack and ran the last few steps. Nothing looked stolen, but someone had been inside. Glove box open, papers scattered, like they were looking for something. I checked under the truck, behind it, everywhere. No one was there. I jumped in and started the engine without thinking. The moment it turned over, I backed out of the brush and drove until I hit pavement. Then another 2 hours before I stopped to breathe. A week later, I reported it to the sheriff in that county. He didn't seem surprised. Said that part of the forest sometimes attracts off-grid squatters or guys running illegal grow-ops. He said the signs I saw, tree damage, prints, my truck being tampered with, sounded like someone trying to scare me off. He told me I was lucky they hadn't done worse. I haven't gone back since. I still camp sometimes, but only in known places. Trailheads, state parks, places with rangers and other people nearby. I miss the quiet sometimes, the true stillness of that forest. But I also remember the silence that came with it. Not peaceful, but dead. Like something was watching and waiting. What really gets to me is that I never saw whoever it was. Never heard them speak. Never found a campsite or trash or anything. Just signs. Just a few things left behind to let me know I was not alone. And that was enough. I went on a solo camping trip back in the summer of 2019. I was 31 at the time, living in Boise, Idaho. I'd always liked being outdoors, especially in places where I couldn't hear cars or people, where the only sounds were wind, trees creaking, and birds moving through the branches. That summer, I had a long weekend off from work and decided to head into a section of forest about 3 hours north of the city. It wasn't a national park, just public land with some fire roads and a few hiking trails. Not too many people went there because there weren't any campgrounds or amenities. That was part of the appeal. I didn't want to share the woods with anyone. I loaded my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, tools, first aid kit, all the usual stuff. I'd done enough trips like this to know what I needed. I had a paper map and a compass too, since I didn't plan on having cell signal out there. My plan was to park off a Forest Service road and hike a few miles in, set up camp by a creek I remembered from a trip a couple of years back, and stay 2 nights. The area had a lot of pine and fir trees, big slopes, and not much undergrowth, so walking off-trail wasn't hard. I figured I'd be completely alone. I started hiking mid-morning and reached the spot I had in mind by early afternoon. The creek was still there, shallow and clear, with smooth rocks under the water. I found a flat spot just above the bank to pitch my tent, with tall trees on all sides and a soft bed of pine needles. Felt good to get the pack off my back. I drank some water, set up my shelter, and got a small fire going. The air smelled like sap and smoke. I didn't see or hear anyone all day. Nothing but squirrels and a few birds moving around in the branches. That first night was peaceful. I stayed up by the fire until it burned down to embers, then climbed into my sleeping bag. It was colder than I expected, but I'd brought the right gear. I drifted off to the sounds of the water and the occasional creak of trees in the wind. I didn't wake up once. The next morning, I made instant coffee and oatmeal, then decided to explore farther upstream. I had the whole day and nowhere to be. I followed the creek for maybe an hour, just taking my time, moving slow and looking around. I saw animal tracks in the soft dirt along the banks. Mostly deer, maybe a fox or coyote. At one point, I heard something moving in the trees uphill from me. I stopped and waited, not making a sound. It went quiet after a few seconds. Probably just a deer. I didn't think much of it and kept walking. I turned around before noon and headed back to camp. I didn't want to be gone too long in case the weather changed. When I got back, everything looked fine. My tent was still standing. Nothing had been touched. I sat by the fire pit and made lunch, just a tortilla with peanut butter and a few pieces of jerky. I stayed around camp the rest of the day, reading a paperback I'd brought and watching the trees. A couple of times I thought I heard faint noises out in the woods, but they were soft and far off. Could have been branches falling or small animals moving. The kind of sounds you get used to out there. I went to bed early that night. It got dark fast, and the clouds covered the moon. I zipped myself into my bag and listened to the creek again, but I didn't fall asleep right away. I had that weird sense, like when you forget if you locked your front door, just a little off. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight. Then I woke up. It was still dark, but not pitch black. My watch said it was just after 3 a.m. I didn't hear anything at first, just the creek. But then I realized something had pulled me out of sleep. I held my breath and listened. There was a soft crunch outside, like a footstep, then another. Slow, steady. I stayed completely still. I didn't bring a gun, but I had a knife. I kept it close when I camped alone. I slid my hand toward it slowly, trying not to make any noise. The steps got closer. Whoever it was, if it was a person, they were moving around the tent, not fast, not trying to hide, just circling. I didn't hear talking or breathing, just the crunch of needles underfoot. I thought about calling out, but decided against it. If someone was messing around my camp in the middle of the night without a light or a word, I didn't want to let them know I was awake. Then the steps stopped. Silence. I waited, gripping the knife, breathing as slow as I could. I didn't hear anything for what felt like 10 minutes. just the wind in the trees and the trickle of the creek. Then the steps started again, farther off this time, heading away from the tent. They faded into the distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep again. When the sun came up, I got out fast. I checked around the tent. No footprints, but the ground was dry and covered in needles, so that didn't surprise me. Nothing was missing or disturbed, but I knew what I'd heard. I packed everything quickly. I thought about leaving then, but the rational part of my brain told me it could have been an animal, maybe even a deer. The slow steps, the circling, it didn't feel like a deer. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I told myself I'd stay one more night, but I'd set up something to keep watch. A trip line maybe, or some kind of signal if someone came near. I moved my tent closer to the creek, where the trees were thinner and I had more visibility. I rigged up a simple perimeter with a few tin cups and sticks from my gear, placed so they'd fall and clatter if someone walked through. Not much, but it made me feel better. I kept my knife on me all day and stayed close to camp. No hikes. I didn't hear anything strange that afternoon. No steps, no movement. That evening, I built up the fire more than usual and let it burn late. When I finally got into the tent, I left the rain flap open just a bit so I could see out and hear better. I stayed awake a long time just listening. The wind had died down, and the forest was quiet. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. Then the noise came again. Not footsteps this time, just the sound of one of the tin cups falling and bouncing once on the ground. My eyes opened instantly. I stayed still, listening. No wind, no other sounds, just that one clink of metal. I waited. After a minute or two, I heard a soft shuffle, like someone crouching or shifting their weight. I reached for the knife again. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to look, to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight, but I didn't. I kept still. After what felt like forever, I heard the shuffle again, farther off, then silence. I waited until dawn. When I got out, I found one of the cups on the ground, about 5 feet from where I'd strung it up. The stick it had been hanging on was broken. Nothing else looked touched, but that confirmed it. Someone had come back. Someone was watching my camp. That was enough. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat or even fill my water. I just got my bag on and started walking. I didn't take the trail. I cut straight through the woods toward the road. I didn't want to risk running into whoever it was if they were still watching. The hike was rough. I kept looking over my shoulder, pausing to listen every few minutes. I saw nothing, heard nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. It took me almost 4 hours to get back to my truck. When I reached it and saw it untouched, a wave of relief hit me so hard my knees went weak. I unlocked it, tossed my pack in, and drove out without stopping. Back in Boise, I told a friend what had happened, just the basics. He thought it might have been a hunter or some drifter, maybe just curious. But there was nothing in my camp worth stealing. No damage, no obvious purpose. That's what got to me. Whoever it was didn't take anything. They didn't say anything. They just watched. That was my last solo trip. I still go camping, but I stick to busier places now. Campgrounds with other people nearby. Sometimes I'll hear footsteps outside my tent at night. Just someone walking to the bathroom or grabbing something from their car. Normal stuff. But every time it happens, I get that same tight feeling in my chest. I wait, holding my breath, listening to see if they stop, if they start circling. I know most people wouldn't think much of it. No one got hurt. Nothing happened, technically, but that's exactly what makes it worse. The not knowing, the silence, the cup falling in the dark and nothing else. I think about it sometimes when I'm lying in bed, when the house is quiet and the neighborhood's asleep. I imagine those footsteps, slow and steady, moving around the walls of my tent, and I wonder how long they stood there, how long they watched, and why. I'll never go that deep into the woods alone again. It was October of 2018 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone at a cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 36 years old then, working a job that drained every bit of energy I had during the week. The city had become loud in ways I hadn't noticed before. People were always rushing, and the sound of traffic and construction had started to feel like nails on a chalkboard. I needed silence. I needed to be alone somewhere quiet, somewhere far from everything. So, when I found this small listing online for a secluded cabin near a place called Alder Creek, it felt like a perfect idea. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, no internet. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive up took me nearly 6 hours. The last part of it was nothing but dirt road that twisted through thick trees. Leaves had turned deep red and orange, and they fell constantly onto the road like confetti. I kept the windows up because the cold air cut sharp even during the day. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked. Sunlight pushing through branches, no other cars in sight, not even a mailbox. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it was already late afternoon. The place was smaller than I imagined, but clean and sturdy, with siding, tin roof, a stone chimney. There was a little shed about 20 feet off to the side, half hidden behind trees, and a narrow path that led down toward the sound of running water. Inside, the cabin was simple. A twin bed, a small wooden table, a chair, and a cast iron stove. No power, but there were a few lanterns hanging on hooks, a pile of chopped wood, and a hand pump for water at the sink. I had brought enough supplies to last me through the weekend. Canned food, a camp stove, flashlight, spare batteries, matches, and a first aid kit. I wasn't trying to rough it, but I wanted quiet, and this place had it. After unpacking and settling in, I lit a lantern, cracked open a beer, and just sat on the steps outside, listening to nothing but trees rustling and the occasional snap of twigs from animals I couldn't see. That first night passed quietly. I slept well, bundled in layers with the fire keeping the room just warm enough. In the morning, I made instant coffee and walked around the property. The path led to a small creek with cold, clear water. I sat on a rock and watched it move around fallen branches. There was no sign of other people anywhere, not even trash or boot prints. It was one of the few times in my adult life I felt truly alone in a good way. Later that day, I decided to check out the shed. It had an old padlock, but the key had been left on a hook inside the cabin. The door creaked loudly when I pulled it open. Inside were the usual tools: an axe, handsaw, some rusty garden tools, a gas can, and what looked like a stack of old wooden crates pushed against the back wall. Nothing unusual. The air smelled like old wood and gasoline. I didn't spend long in there. That evening, I made a small fire outside and sat under the stars. There were so many stars. Without city lights, they looked like they were doubled in number. I ate a cold can of beans and sat quietly, watching the fire until it burned down. I felt content. That was probably the last moment I truly felt that way. It started with sounds, very faint at first. On the second night, as I was lying in bed, I heard what I thought was a branch snapping outside. Nothing unusual in the woods, so I ignored it. But then I heard it again. Not just a snap, but a deliberate crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. I sat up, turned off the lantern, and listened. For a while, it was completely quiet. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it sounded too heavy, too slow for an animal. I waited maybe 20 minutes, heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Then it stopped. Whatever it was, I didn't hear it again that night. The next day, I tried to brush it off. Animals live in the woods. That's their home, not mine. I spent the day chopping some wood, exploring a bit further up the creek, and reading a book I'd brought. But I kept looking over my shoulder more than before. That night, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I checked the shed, closed the latch on the cabin door, and even wedged a chair under the knob. I lay in bed fully clothed with my flashlight on the pillow beside me. And again, I heard it. This time, closer. Definitely footsteps, slow and spaced out, circling the cabin. I didn't move, just listened. They would stop for a long time, then start again like whoever or whatever it was standing still, waiting. At one point, they got so close I could hear leaves being pushed aside, almost like someone brushing against the wall of the cabin itself. I didn't sleep at all that night. When daylight came, I stepped outside cautiously, holding the axe I'd taken from the shed. There were faint marks in the ground, flattened patches of leaves, a few scuffed spots in the dirt, but nothing clear enough to say for sure what it was. Could have been my own tracks. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, then out toward the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched had burrowed deep into my skin. I considered leaving that day. I had enough gas in the car, and my nerves were fried. But some dumb, stubborn part of me didn't want to feel like I had been chased away by nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it really was an animal and I was letting my imagination run wild. So I stayed, but I didn't relax. I kept the axe with me, stayed close to the cabin, and hardly touched the food I'd brought. Everything felt wrong. That night, I barely kept the fire going. I was too focused on the woods, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees over and over. I thought maybe I could scare off whatever it was just by showing I was alert. But just after midnight, something happened that pushed everything too far. There was a sound behind the shed, a solid thump, not a twig or a footstep. Something hit the side of it. I ran toward it without thinking, shining the light on the wall. Nothing. Then I swung the beam around and caught a figure in the corner of the light. Just a flash of a person, half hidden behind the trees. It was so quick, I almost convinced myself I hadn't seen it. But the shape was clear, upright, human-sized, moving fast. I yelled, even though I knew it was pointless. There was no answer, and they were gone. I didn't go back inside the cabin. I locked the door, sure, but I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, axe in my hands, flashlight off. I didn't want to give away my position. Every sound from the woods sounded like footsteps now. Every breeze that moved the trees made my muscles tense. It was a long, endless night, and when the sun finally came up, I was shaking from exhaustion and cold. I decided to leave immediately. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes, dumped what I didn't need in the trash barrel behind the cabin, and jumped in the car. But as I drove back down the dirt road, something made me stop. About a quarter-mile from the cabin, I spotted something odd on the side of the road. A piece of red fabric, torn and tangled in a branch. I got out, heart pounding, and found that it was part of a flannel shirt, just hanging there, like someone brushed past it in a hurry. Not mine. I looked around, but there was no one. I got back in the car and didn't stop until I hit the main road hours later. Back in the city, everything felt loud again, but now it was a kind of comfort. I was surrounded by people, by noise, by light. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, the footsteps, the figure, the shirt. I hadn't imagined all of it. Someone had been out there, maybe watching me, maybe waiting for me to fall asleep, maybe just messing with me, but it was real. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office once I got home. I didn't expect them to find anything, and I doubt they even went up there. I never heard back. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still take trips now and then, but never alone and never without cell service. I got rid of the axe too. I don't like the way it made me feel, sitting there with it in the dark, listening for someone who never came inside. What scares me most isn't what happened, though. It's what didn't. It's that whoever was out there never tried to break in, never spoke, never showed themselves fully. They didn't have to. They just let me know they were there. That was enough. That's what still keeps me up sometimes. Thinking about those woods, that shed, those footsteps, is how easily someone can become a part of your weekend without ever needing to say a word. I was 31 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the summer of 2022. I lived in Southern Oregon at the time, in a small town called Glendale, working remotely as a freelance survey technician. Most of my days were spent staring at maps and topography lines on a screen. I had gone camping a few times growing up, mostly with my uncle and cousins, but never truly by myself. That summer, I'd been feeling burnt out and anxious from the isolation of working from home, and I thought being out in nature for a few days might help clear my head. I didn't want to go anywhere too crowded or well-known. After doing some searching online, I came across an old blog post about a place called Little Rock Lake, deep in the Fremont-Winema National Forest. The article mentioned that it was remote, not maintained anymore by the Forest Service, and rarely visited. That was perfect for what I wanted: peace and quiet, no cell service, and a chance to completely disconnect. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, 2 coolers of food and water, a portable stove, some basic fishing gear, bear spray, a knife, and an emergency satellite beacon just in case. I also brought a paper map of the area since I couldn't rely on my phone out there. It was a 3-hour drive from Glendale, most of it on back roads, and the last stretch was a winding dirt path full of potholes and fallen branches. I didn't see another car for nearly an hour once I turned off the highway. When I finally reached the spot marked on the map, there wasn't much to it. A clearing just big enough to park the truck, and a faint path that led into the trees. No signage, no designated campsites, just a thinning of pine trees and an overgrown trail. I left the truck tucked behind some brush and followed the path with my gear. After about 15 minutes of walking, I saw the lake, small, surrounded by dense forest and completely still. It didn't even look like the wind ever touched it. There was a clearing along the shore, just big enough to pitch a tent. I set up camp and spent the rest of the evening organizing things, collecting firewood, and fishing off a log that jutted into the water. I didn't catch anything, but it didn't matter. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The only sound was the buzzing of insects, and the last bit of sunlight made the lake look like glass. I felt better almost immediately. When night came, I sat by the fire, ate a can of soup, and stared at the flames until the cold made me crawl into my sleeping bag. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up a few times because of how quiet it was. Too quiet. At home, I always heard distant cars or the hum of appliances. Out there, once the fire died, there was nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through trees or the distant hoot of an owl. Took some time to get used to. The next morning, I made coffee on the stove and ate granola while sitting on a flat rock by the lake. I decided to hike around the shoreline to see if there were better spots or maybe trails leading elsewhere. I brought a small backpack with water, a snack, and a whistle. The terrain around the lake was rough, with thick undergrowth, fallen logs, and uneven rocks. I moved slowly, trying to make sure I didn't twist an ankle or lose track of my location. About an hour into the hike, I found something strange. It was a large tree, split down the middle and blackened at the base like it had been hit by lightning. But the surrounding trees were untouched, and there hadn't been any storms in the area for weeks according to the forecast. Around the tree were dozens of small, broken branches stacked in what looked like a pattern, a wide circle. It didn't look natural. I crouched down and poked at them with a stick, but didn't touch anything with my hands. My first thought was that someone had camped there a while ago and made some sort of fire ring or marker, but there were no ashes, no trash, nothing else. I took a few steps back and looked around. I didn't see any footprints or signs of people, but I felt something then, a weird weight in my chest, like someone was standing behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there, just forest. I stood still for a while, trying to make sense of the feeling, but it didn't go away until I walked away from the spot. Back at camp, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just spooked because I was alone and not used to that level of silence. I spent the rest of the day reading a paperback, trying to fish again, and adding more wood to my supply. That night, I made a small fire and watched the stars come out, trying not to think about that split tree. But something changed that night. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound soft but steady. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, listening. It was like a thudding or maybe footsteps, but they were irregular. Not close, not right outside the tent, but out in the woods. I couldn't tell the direction, and it stopped after maybe 30 seconds. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't fall back asleep for a long time. The next morning, I walked around the immediate area, looking for anything out of place. I didn't find tracks or signs of animals, but I did notice that one of the smaller branches I'd collected and leaned against a stump was now on the ground, broken in half. It could have been nothing. Maybe it fell or I'd stepped on it earlier without noticing, but it made me uneasy. I thought about leaving, but I also didn't want to seem paranoid. I told myself it was just forest sounds, animals moving through the brush, maybe deer. I stayed another night. That was the worst one. It was around midnight when I heard it again. Footsteps. this time closer. Slow, deliberate. I sat up and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The fire had burned down to embers, but the moon was bright enough to see silhouettes. I scanned the trees, heart pounding, holding the bear spray in one hand and the knife in the other. I stayed like that for at least 10 minutes. Then I saw movement, just a flicker at the edge of the trees, something ducking behind a trunk. Not an animal. It was too upright. I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body locked. My mouth was dry, and I felt sweat run down my neck despite the cold. Whoever or whatever it was didn't come closer. After what felt like an hour, the forest was still again. I didn't sleep at all. I kept the knife beside me, the bear spray in my hand, and waited for sunrise. As soon as it was light, I packed everything up. Tent, gear, coolers, everything went back in the truck. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just got out. The drive back felt endless. Every time I turned down a stretch of road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone following, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. When I got home, I looked up reports of missing people or strange encounters in that area. I didn't find anything, just old blog posts, trail reviews, and a few articles about forest fires years back. I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe someone living off-grid. Maybe just a hunter passing through who didn't want to be seen. But I know what I saw. Something upright, something aware of me, and something that didn't want me there. I haven't gone camping since. I still spend time outside, but I stay close to towns now. I'll walk forest trails, sure, but I always go with a friend, and I never go off trail. That trip changed the way I think about solitude. I wanted peace and quiet, but what I got was something else entirely. There was no moment of confrontation, no final scare, no dramatic escape. But what happened was real, too real, and that's what makes it stick with me. Not the silence of the forest, but the feeling that I was never truly alone out there. I'd always wanted to get away from it all, to disconnect, and find some peace in nature. That's how I ended up at a small, remote cabin in the woods of northern Michigan. It was early November, the kind of season where the air has a bite to it, but the ground hasn't yet frozen solid. The leaves on the trees had already turned into shades of amber and gold, and the skies were often overcast, heavy with the impending promise of snow. My name is Ben Richards, and I was 29 years old when I decided to take this solo trip. My life in the city had become a bit too much to handle. The noise, the constant rush, the traffic, it all had a way of wearing me down. I thought that spending a week alone in a cabin would clear my mind, give me time to think. The cabin was an old place, tucked away deep in a forest, far from any signs of civilization. The nearest town was about 30 miles away, and the road leading up to the cabin was a narrow, unpaved trail that barely looked wide enough to fit my car. I had been following the directions I'd received online, but after a while, I started to wonder if I had made a wrong turn. The trees around me were dense, the kind that looked like they had been there for centuries, twisting their branches high above. The silence was almost suffocating. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional screech of a crow in the distance. I had my windows down, trying to take in the fresh, earthy scent of the forest, but that only seemed to make the quiet more intense. The deeper I drove, the more isolated I felt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the cabin in the distance. It was small, one story, with a weathered wooden exterior that had clearly seen better days. It looked like something out of an old postcard. There was no electricity, no running water, just a small, rustic shelter in the woods. Perfect place to get away from it all. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and walked up to the cabin. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside the cabin smelled musty. Dust and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the corners. There was a single room with a fireplace on one wall, a small kitchen area to the right, and a rickety wooden table with mismatched chairs. A few items of old furniture were scattered around: a faded couch, a cracked coffee table, and a bed tucked away in the back corner. The walls were bare, except for a few framed photos of nature scenes, maybe placed there by the previous owners to make it feel homier. There was something eerie about the stillness of the place. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the hearth, the crackling flames providing the only warmth and light. The evening was fast approaching, and the chill of the forest outside began to creep in. I couldn't help but feel the isolation of the place. It was different from what I had imagined. More haunting, more empty. That night, I went to bed early. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, though the sheets felt a little rough. I tried to fall asleep, but my mind kept wandering. I had been looking forward to this solitude, but now that I was here, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The wind outside howled through the trees, and every so often, I would hear the creak of the wooden walls settling. My eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see a figure standing outside, but nothing was there. The silence of the cabin pressed in around me, and I felt a rising unease in my chest. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a faint tapping, like something scratching at the walls. It was coming from the back corner of the cabin, near the window. My heart raced as I lay there in the dark, straining to listen. The noise continued for several seconds, then stopped abruptly. I lay still, holding my breath. My mind raced with all sorts of wild thoughts. Maybe it was an animal, perhaps a raccoon or something smaller that had found its way inside the walls. But no, it sounded too deliberate, like something was moving around just outside my reach. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped out of bed, my feet cold against the floorboards. I crept over to the window and peered outside, but there was nothing there. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, hidden just beyond the reach of the light. But I saw nothing. I returned to bed, trying to shake off the unease that had taken root in my chest. The rest of the night passed in fitful, uneasy sleep, with the occasional creak of the house and the distant howling of the wind. But nothing else disturbed me. The next morning, I woke up to a pale, gray light filtering in through the trees. I got dressed, made some coffee on the small stove, and sat down at the table to eat breakfast. The cabin was even colder than it had been the night before, and the silence was unnerving. Felt like the world outside was holding its breath. I spent the day walking around the area, trying to push the strange occurrences from my mind. The forest around the cabin was dense and beautiful. The leaves had mostly fallen by now, leaving the ground covered in a carpet of brown, crunching underfoot. I noticed a few animal tracks here and there, deer, squirrels, maybe even a bear, but nothing that indicated any immediate danger. The woods were peaceful, if not a little too quiet. But as evening approached, the feeling of isolation grew heavier. The cabin was far from any road, and the thought of being so alone in the wilderness began to feel more and more unsettling. The idea that something or someone could be out there, just beyond the trees, watching me, it was hard to shake. That night, I decided to take some extra precautions. I locked the door, secured the windows, and piled extra firewood on the hearth. I had brought a small radio with me, hoping the noise would make the place feel a little less silent. But when I turned it on, all I could hear was static. It was the kind of eerie silence that made every small sound feel amplified. I lay in bed, my eyes flicking to the window every few seconds, but nothing was out of place. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I was woken by a loud banging sound. It was sharp and sudden, echoing through the cabin like a clap of thunder. My heart leaped in my chest, and I jumped out of bed, stumbling to the door. The noise had come from the back of the cabin again, the same place as the night before. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way over to the window. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened the curtain and shined the beam of light out into the darkness. There was nothing there. The woods were still, the trees swaying gently in the wind, casting long shadows on the ground. I shone the light around, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was nothing unusual, just the same silent, eerie landscape. I walked back to the bed, my pulse still racing. My thoughts were spinning. What was going on? What was making that noise? Was it something natural? Or was I just letting my imagination run wild? I tried to go back to sleep, but the banging continued. It came in waves, first a thud, then a series of lighter taps, as if someone was trying to knock on the door, or something was scraping against the side of the cabin. The sounds were maddening, and my nerves were starting to fray. In a burst of frustration and fear, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The air was colder now, biting against my skin as I made my way around the cabin, shining the flashlight along the walls, looking for anything that could explain the noise. My breath came in ragged bursts, visible in the pale light of the moon. But there was nothing, no sign of animals, no evidence of wind or rain that could be causing it. Just the same stillness that had been there when I first arrived. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a shadow moving between the trees. My heart stopped. It was just a glimpse, a flash of movement, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what I had seen. Had someone been out there? Had I not been alone this whole time? I stood there for a long time, trying to steady my breath, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But the figure was gone now, swallowed by the darkness. The only sound was the wind through the trees. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin felt smaller, more confining now, as though it were closing in around me. I sat by the fire, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself. The noise stopped after that as suddenly as it had started. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, with me lying in bed, wide awake, waiting for something else to happen. But it didn't. The night passed without any further disturbance. The next morning, I packed my things and left as early as I could. The feeling of dread still hung over me, the weight of the woods pressing on my chest. I didn't know what had happened, but I didn't want to stay to find out. The cabin had become something else, something strange and unsettling, and I had no intention of coming back. I drove away, leaving the cabin behind me, and didn't look back. Maybe it was just the isolation, the quiet, or the fact that I had been in a strange place for too long. But what I was 32 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the backwoods of northern Idaho. It was July 2017, and I had just wrapped up a heavy few months of freelance design work, staring at screens for 10 to 12 hours a day. I was burned out and needed to be away from everything. Phones, cars, people. I wanted to feel like I didn't exist for a while, like I was completely removed from the constant notifications and noise. I chose a place called Dead Horse Creek. It was a stretch of forest tucked between two ridges, far enough from the nearest town that I wouldn't hear or see anyone for days. I'd read about it in an old forum post where someone mentioned it was as quiet as you can get without stepping into Canada. That sounded perfect to me. I packed everything I thought I'd need. A tent, a sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, a water filter, extra clothes, a hatchet, a small camp stove, a couple knives, a flashlight, and my GPS with extra batteries. I also brought a topo map and compass just in case the electronics failed. I made sure to tell my brother where I was going and when I'd be back. I planned to hike out, set up camp for 4 days and hike back. Nothing fancy, just isolation. The first day went smooth. I drove my truck as far as the dirt road would let me, then loaded my pack and headed in. The hike was beautiful, green pines, low ferns, and the kind of clean air that only exists miles from pavement. I passed along the creek bed for about 4 miles before settling on a spot about 30 yards from the water. It was flat and shaded, but open enough to not feel claustrophobic. I pitched my tent, collected firewood, filtered some water, and sat down on a log to eat dinner while the sun slipped behind the trees. That first night was uneventful, just the usual forest sounds. Crickets, wind, maybe a branch cracking under an animal's foot somewhere far off. I fell asleep easily, grateful for the escape. The second day I explored. I walked upstream for about 2 miles and found a natural pool, deep and cold. I took a swim, careful not to slip on the rocks. The sun warmed me up fast afterward, and I dried off lying on a boulder. That night I cooked rice and beans on the little stove and watched the stars come out. No problems, no stress. I felt like I'd made the right decision. It was the third night when things changed. I had gone to bed early, maybe around 9 p.m. The sky had been cloudy, and I was tired from a long hike I took earlier in the day that had me bushwhacking up one of the ridges. I fell asleep listening to the wind in the trees and woke up maybe 2 hours later to a different sound. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just the feeling that the normal forest sounds had stopped. No bugs, no rustling, nothing. Just the breeze, which had picked up a little. I opened my eyes and lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. The silence was too complete, like everything had frozen. Then I heard a snap. It was close, too close. Not like a branch falling far away, but like someone stepping on a stick maybe 20 or 30 feet from my tent. I held my breath and stayed still, trying to process. Could be a deer, I told myself. Maybe even a moose. But the steps weren't random or fast. They were slow, deliberate. Step, crunch, pause, another step, then nothing. I sat up quietly, heart beating harder now. I pulled my flashlight from beside my sleeping bag but didn't turn it on yet. The walls of the tent were too thin to see through, so I just waited, trying to hear more. Couple minutes passed with nothing. I slowly unzipped the tent and poked my head out. Pitch black. Cloud cover blocked the moon, and the trees made everything darker. I still didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to give away my position if it was someone out there. I listened hard. Still nothing. Then a soft rustling, like something brushing against low branches, maybe 15 feet away. Then a grunt, quiet but not animal-like. It sounded human, like someone catching their breath while crouching or shifting their weight. I froze. My body wanted to panic, but I stayed low and crawled out of the tent, moving slow and quiet to the other side, putting the tent between me and the sound. I crouched there, waiting. More silence. Then, after maybe 5 minutes, a long, dragging sound like a stick or a foot being pulled through leaves and dirt. It moved laterally across the front of my tent. I didn't dare move. After a few more minutes, it was gone. I waited another 20, maybe 30 minutes before moving. I slowly circled back toward the creek and filled my Nalgene just for something to do. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to think. Could it have been someone hunting? Possible, but unlikely this far in. Maybe a lost hiker? But the movements didn't sound confused. They sounded careful. Too careful. Eventually I went back to the tent, but I didn't sleep much. Every little sound made me flinch. I kept my knife in hand and the flashlight on my chest. The sun couldn't rise fast enough. By morning, the forest sounded normal again. Birds were chirping. The creek was bubbling. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the unease. I got up, packed my gear, and decided I'd move camp further upstream, somewhere with better visibility and fewer thick brush lines nearby. As I was packing, I noticed something I hadn't before. A boot print. It wasn't mine. Too large. Wide toe. Deep heel. It had been pressed into the soft dirt near a tree about 10 feet from my tent. The tread was different from my hiking boots. It looked older, like something from a work boot or logger boot, not a modern brand. And it was facing my camp, not away from it. That sealed it. I moved. I hiked about 2 miles upstream and found a spot on a gentle slope with a view down to the creek. It was rockier but safer, I thought. Harder to approach quietly. I set up again, this time more carefully. I cleared brush in a 15-foot radius, hung a few small noise traps using fishing line and tin lids, and kept my pack by my side instead of inside the tent. I figured if something happened again, I could grab and go. That evening, I skipped cooking. I ate granola bars and jerky and kept the fire small, more for morale than warmth. I stayed awake longer, watching the trees and listening. I didn't hear anything unusual, and by midnight I crawled into the tent and tried to rest. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. There was no sound this time, just a feeling, that same oppressive silence as the night before. I sat up, knife already in hand, and waited. Then I heard it. A soft crunch, but not on leaves. On rock, somewhere to my right, maybe 20 feet away. Then a slow, careful step. Another, then silence. My traps didn't make noise, which meant whoever or whatever it was came in from a different angle. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and flashlight, crawled out, and crept into the trees opposite the noise. I found a spot between two fallen logs and lay low, watching. I didn't dare turn on the flashlight. After about 10 minutes, a faint shape moved through the darkness near my tent. I couldn't see it clearly, just that it was tall, definitely a person. They moved slowly around the tent, stopping once or twice to bend down, like they were inspecting something. Then, to my surprise, they moved away, not toward the creek, but back up the slope and into the woods. I waited another 15 minutes before moving. I went back to the tent, broke it down fast, stuffed everything into the pack and left. I didn't even care about leaving trash behind. I just needed to go. I hiked fast, headlamp off most of the time, using my compass to stay oriented. It was the longest night of my life. I didn't stop until daylight. By then, I was miles from the original site, exhausted and sore. I found a patch of ground near a rock outcropping and took a short nap while the sun rose. Then I kept hiking until I hit the dirt road and eventually made it back to the truck. I didn't look back once. I never reported it. What could I even say? That I heard something and saw a vague shape? That someone walked near my tent? There wasn't any crime, technically. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. That wasn't just some lost camper. They were watching me, moving slow, careful, patient. I haven't camped alone since then. I still go out sometimes, but only with others and never too deep. I stick to state parks and marked trails. I still think about it sometimes when I lie awake at night. I wonder who they were, what they wanted, if they were just curious or something worse. I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. What I do know is that there are parts of the forest where the silence means something, where the usual rules don't apply, where someone might be watching not ghosts or monsters, but people, real people with real intentions. And that's the scariest thing of all. It was the last week of September when I took time off from work and decided to go on a solo camping trip in the northern woods of Michigan. I had been stressed out for months, just working long days at the warehouse, dealing with people, traffic, noise, everything piling up on me. I didn't want to go somewhere touristy or flashy. I wanted to go somewhere quiet and isolated, where I could hear myself breathe, maybe fish a little, sit by the fire, and just reset my brain. I picked a spot I found online, a remote lake near the Upper Peninsula, barely marked on any map, surrounded by thick forest and only accessible by an old logging trail. The few reviews I found talked about how peaceful it was and how you were unlikely to see anyone else for days. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, fishing rod, a cooler, fire starter, a few knives, a small hatchet, 2 flashlights, extra batteries, and my old .22 rifle. I never really expected to use it, but I always brought it just in case I ran into a bear or something. The weather was supposed to be clear, maybe a little chilly at night, but nothing too harsh. I left early that morning, got coffee at a gas station on the way, and drove 5 hours north. The further I got, the fewer cars I saw. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road, and after about 30 minutes of slow, bumpy driving, I reached the trailhead. The parking area was just a flat patch of dirt with enough space for maybe 2 cars. There weren't any other vehicles there. I parked, double-checked my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown in places and barely visible in others. It wound through thick woods for about 3 miles until I reached the lake. It was just as beautiful as I'd imagined. The water was still and black, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees. No signs of people, no sound but the breeze and birds. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, where the ground was flat and covered in pine needles. I had a good view of the water and enough distance from the trees to be safe from falling branches. After setting everything up, I gathered wood and built a fire pit with stones. I cooked some sausages over the flames and ate as the sun dipped behind the trees, turning the lake orange. That night, I slept harder than I had in months. Just the sound of leaves and crickets outside, the cold air pressing against the sides of the tent, and nothing else. The next 2 days were the same kind of peaceful. I spent my time walking around the lake, fishing, reading, and just sitting still. I didn't bring my phone except for emergencies, and I left it off most of the time. I saw deer once, drinking at the far side of the lake, and watched a bald eagle skim across the water. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how noisy your life usually is. On the third night, something felt a little off. I had gone to sleep like usual, after eating and tending the fire until it burned down to coals. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, not suddenly, just kind of slowly becoming aware that I was awake. There wasn't any sound, not even the usual rustling or insects. I thought maybe I'd just been dreaming, but I had that odd feeling you get when your instincts are trying to tell you something. I stayed still for a long time, listening. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finally unzipped the tent quietly and stuck my head out. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of the trees, and the lake was smooth like glass. I waited, staring at the woods, trying to pick out any movement, but everything looked still. I figured it was just my imagination and went back inside, but I left my boots near the zipper in case I needed to get out quickly. It took me a while to fall back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately noticed something strange. There were small marks in the dirt near the fire pit. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, maybe raccoons or something, but they didn't look quite right. They were shallow, narrow, and came in from the woods. They stopped about 10 feet from the tent and then went back the way they came. I crouched down and studied them for a while, trying to figure out what made them. The shape wasn't right for deer or coyotes, and they were too far apart for smaller animals. They looked almost like the indentations of shoes, but not deep enough to be from someone walking normally. I brushed it off. Maybe it was an animal I wasn't familiar with. Maybe the ground was just soft in places and made weird shapes. I kept telling myself not to let my imagination get carried away. Still, I couldn't get that feeling out of my head, that sense of being watched. That day, I went for a longer hike, trying to shake off the unease. I circled the lake, taking my time, looking for signs of other people or anything unusual. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I didn't even see any birds, which felt strange. Normally, you'd hear at least the occasional woodpecker or squirrel. It was like everything had packed up and left. I got back to camp around 5 p.m. and rebuilt the fire. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling jumpy. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I cooked some food and ate fast, and by the time the sun went down, I was already on edge. I made sure everything was locked up in the bear canister and pulled into the tent early. I lay there in my sleeping bag, flashlight in my hand, rifle next to me, just staring at the ceiling of the tent. Around midnight, I heard it. A single footstep outside. Just one. The kind of sound someone makes when they step on a branch and break it under their weight. Not a crash, not a bunch of movement, just one deliberate, quiet snap. I didn't move. My heart started racing, and my ears strained to pick up any follow-up noise. But there was nothing. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then I heard a faint shuffle, like something brushing against the edge of the tent, down near my feet. I didn't even breathe. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. My other hand was slowly moving toward the rifle. I wrapped my fingers around it and waited. Every muscle in my body was locked. Another few minutes passed. Then silence again. I stayed like that for at least an hour, barely blinking. I don't think I slept at all. Eventually, the sky started to lighten outside, and I felt safe enough to move. I unzipped the tent slowly and crawled out. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were boot prints all around my tent. Human boot prints. They circled the whole thing. Some passed close by the fire pit, others led toward the woods. There were at least a dozen different impressions in the pine needles and dirt, and they weren't mine. I checked. My boots were still inside the tent, dry and clean. I hadn't walked around that night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. Then I walked toward the trees, trying to follow them. They led about 20 feet into the woods and then just vanished. The pine needles made it hard to track, and I couldn't tell where the person had come from or gone. But someone had definitely been there, watching me. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly. Just jammed everything into my pack. I kept the rifle in my hands the whole time. When I was ready, I started hiking back down the trail, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods were still too quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. About halfway back to my truck, I noticed something else. A broken tree branch hanging low over the trail, about chest height. That hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been snapped intentionally and bent across the path. I stepped over it and kept moving. Another 100 yards down, I saw a pile of small rocks stacked in the middle of the trail. That hadn't been there either. Someone was following me, or maybe they'd been ahead of me. I picked up the pace, trying not to run but moving fast. I gripped the rifle tighter, constantly scanning the trees. The last half mile felt like it took an hour. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost broke into a sprint. The truck was untouched. I got in, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I just drove. The tires skidded a little on the dirt as I pulled out, and I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road. It took me a few hours to fully calm down. I stopped at a diner about 50 miles south and sat there with a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything. The prints, the noise, the rearranged trail. None of it made sense unless someone had been out there, watching me, messing with me. But why? There was nothing valuable in my camp. No one had taken anything. They could have hurt me, but they didn't. They just watched. When I got home, I didn't unpack right away. I left everything in the garage and sat in the living room with the curtains closed. For days, I kept thinking about those boot prints and the sound of that single footstep outside my tent. I checked local news for anything about missing people or strange reports near that lake. But there was nothing. I didn't report it to the police. What would I even say? I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about it sometimes. About how far away that place was, how quiet it was, how whoever was out there knew I was alone. I think that's what gets me the most. They knew I was by myself. They knew exactly where I was. It was late September when I decided to take that camping trip. The kind of trip that was meant to be peaceful, a chance to disconnect from everything for a few days. No phones, no distractions, just me, nature, and the simple quiet of the woods. I was 28, living in a small town in Michigan, working a desk job that had started to wear on me. I'd been to this forest before, but only on day hikes. This time, I wanted to camp. I wanted to experience the full thing. Setting up a tent, cooking over a fire, and being out there in the quiet. Maybe I needed a break more than I realized, or maybe I was just tired of the noise of everyday life. Either way, I packed my gear, got in my truck, and drove a couple of hours to a place called Big Pines National Forest. I pulled up to the parking lot at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. It was colder than I expected for September, and the trees were starting to turn, their leaves showing off a little early autumn color. I could already smell the earthy, pine-scented air that I loved so much, and for a moment, I felt at peace. The trail I was heading to was a loop that stretched about 8 miles, and the campsite was right on a small creek. It was a popular spot for people who wanted to get away but still be close enough to civilization if they needed it. I knew it wouldn't be completely isolated, but that didn't matter. I was looking for solitude, not total isolation. I started the hike around 4 p.m., trying to pace myself. The trail wasn't difficult, mostly flat, and it wasn't long before I was deep into the forest, the canopy of trees overhead blocking out most of the sun. The air was cool but not cold, and with every step, I felt more and more disconnected from the hustle and bustle of the world. This was exactly what I needed. By the time I reached the campsite around 6 p.m., the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The spot was perfect, an open clearing next to the creek, with a fire ring already in place and a few logs set up as benches. I dropped my backpack on the ground, relieved to have made it. I set up my tent first, securing the stakes into the damp earth, then gathered some firewood from the pile nearby. The creek babbled gently behind me, and the sound was soothing. I started the fire without much trouble, something I was familiar with from my occasional camping trips. The flames crackled and popped, and the warmth spread through the cool evening air. I took out a can of chili and heated it over the fire, the smell of food mixing with the pine scent around me. As I sat there, eating and watching the fire dance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This was exactly what I had needed. It wasn't long before the sun finally set, leaving the forest in a twilight haze. The stars began to appear one by one, slowly filling the sky with their cold, distant light. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows around the clearing. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. I felt completely alone, but not in a bad way, just alone enough to be free of everything that had been weighing on my mind. As the night deepened, I started to feel that familiar sense of unease that sometimes comes with being out in the wilderness. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but more like a heightened awareness. The forest had a life of its own, and while it was beautiful, it also reminded you that you were a visitor here. This wasn't home, and the longer you stayed, the more you realized how small and fragile you were in comparison to the world around you. I tossed another log on the fire, and as the flames flared up, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the clearing. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but I definitely saw it. Just a flash of movement, like something had darted between the trees. It wasn't a bear. I knew what they looked like from past encounters. This was smaller, more like a person's shape, but moving at a pace that seemed too fast for a human. I froze, watching the spot where I thought I saw it, but nothing else moved. The shadows played tricks in the firelight, and after a minute, I convinced myself it was nothing more than the wind shifting through the branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was one of those instincts you can't quite explain, like the hairs on the back of your neck standing up when you feel someone watching you. I couldn't decide if it was just my imagination or something more. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe the darkness, but whatever it was, I started to feel more aware of every noise around me. The wind, the crackling fire, the occasional snap of a branch. Even the sound of the creek seemed louder now. I finished my dinner quickly and decided to turn in early. The night had a strange energy to it, and I figured a good night's sleep would help clear my head. I slipped into my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and settled in, leaving the fire to burn out on its own. The air inside the tent was cool but not uncomfortable, and soon enough, I drifted off to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the first thing I noticed was the silence. The usual forest noises had stopped. No rustling leaves, no wind, nothing. I lay still, listening, but all I could hear was my own breath. It was the kind of silence that made everything feel too quiet. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps on the ground outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. It wasn't the noise of an animal like a deer or a raccoon. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call out? Should I confront whoever was out there? I didn't know if it was a person, but the possibility made my skin crawl. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise, and switched it on. The beam of light flickered in the dark, casting shadows inside the tent. Another crunch, this time closer. I froze, holding my breath again, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped, and for what felt like an eternity, everything was still. Too still. I couldn't move. I didn't know if I was being watched or if I was just overthinking it, but every instinct I had told me that something wasn't right. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I heard a voice. It was faint, muffled by the fabric of the tent, but it sounded like it was coming from the other side. I held my breath again. The voice sounded strange, almost like it was whispering, but not to me. It wasn't a normal whisper, though. It felt off, like it was trying to stay hidden. The voice faded away, and the footsteps started again. This time retreating, moving further back into the woods. My pulse was racing now. Whoever or whatever had been out there was leaving, but the dread didn't leave with it. I waited in silence for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, and everything was still. Too still. I checked my gear, checked the perimeter, but I couldn't find anything. No signs of anyone or anything having been there, just the normal sounds of the forest slowly creeping back in. I didn't know what had happened, but whatever it was gone. I stayed up the rest of the night, too unsettled to sleep, keeping the fire going and the flashlight close. When morning finally came, I packed up my things quickly. The sun was up, the forest was quiet again, and I felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. I had no idea who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back here again. I hiked out of the woods as quickly as I could, my heart still racing. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I drove away without a second thought, the woods now a memory I'd never shake. I was 34 when it happened. It's been years now, but I still think about it almost every day. The sounds, the cold, the way my stomach felt when I realized how badly I had messed up. I had no one to blame but myself. I made the decisions. I packed the gear. I ignored the signs, and I almost didn't make it back. This was in the summer of 2017. I had taken 2 weeks off from my job as a mechanic in Eugene, Oregon. I was tired of people mostly, the noise of the shop, the constant ringing of the phone, the fake smiles from customers who would turn sour over the smallest things. I needed out. I had been planning a long solo hiking and camping trip for a while, and I figured July would be perfect. I didn't want the usual trails. I wasn't looking for campgrounds, RVs, or guided tours. I wanted solitude. I wanted to test myself. I wanted something rough, something raw. That's how I ended up researching abandoned fire roads and forgotten trails in the Willamette National Forest. I found a forum post from a guy who had mapped out a trail called the Valley Cutoff, a narrow, overgrown fire route from the 80s that wasn't officially on any modern maps but still existed in pieces. He said it was quiet, isolated, full of wildlife, and not traveled anymore. He even included GPS coordinates. That was all I needed. I packed everything carefully. I had a sturdy 70-liter backpack, a one-man tent, a decent sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees Fahrenheit, a hatchet, a hunting knife, waterproof matches, a stove, freeze-dried meals, iodine tablets, a life straw, a few protein bars, and a loaded .357 revolver I kept in a padded side holster just in case of bears or cougars. My phone was charged, and I brought a solar charger, even though I knew I'd have no reception once I got deep enough. I also had a paper map, a compass, and a printed version of the forum guy's directions. I wasn't reckless. I thought I was ready. The trailhead was just past a closed-off service gate about 90 minutes east of Sweet Home. I parked my truck about a half-mile down the road at a pullout, hid it well under some tree cover, and started walking. The first few days were beautiful. The air smelled clean. I saw deer, squirrels, even a black bear at a distance, too far to be a threat. The trail was narrow and rough, just like I hoped. A lot of downed trees, thorny branches that tore at my sleeves, steep inclines that made my calves burn. But it was perfect. I made camp each evening beside a stream or a flat patch of earth, cooked over the stove, and stared at the stars until I fell asleep. No people, no noise, just me and the forest. On the fourth day, I reached what I thought was the halfway point of the Valley Cutoff. There was a collapsed fire watchtower on top of a small ridge, rusted and leaning into the trees like an old skeleton. The view was amazing, though. I could see the entire valley below, dense trees for miles with a thin stream glinting in the distance. I felt invincible. That night, I camped just below the ridge near a dry creek bed. I set up the tent under a pine canopy, lit a small fire, and warmed up a pouch of chicken and rice. I remember feeling a little uneasy, like something was off, but I shrugged it off. The forest makes noises. Twigs snap. Owls hoot. You get used to it. I told myself I was just tired. It was the fifth day when things started to go wrong. It started simple. I couldn't find the trail. I woke up, packed everything, and tried to follow the path the way I had marked on my map and GPS. But the trail just wasn't there. It was like it had vanished overnight. I walked in circles for an hour, thinking I had made a mistake, but I kept ending up at the same spot, the dry creek bed. I checked the map again. It didn't make sense. According to the GPS, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, but the ground in front of me was dense with brush and downed trees. The trail had been here. I had followed it to this spot, but it was gone. I didn't panic, not right away. I figured maybe a storm or a rock slide had shifted the trail. I decided to head downhill toward the stream I had seen from the ridge the day before. If I could follow that, I could eventually find a Forest Service road or a known trail. It was slow going. The terrain got worse the further I went. Thick underbrush, slippery rocks, dead branches that cracked underfoot. The slope was steeper than I remembered. I slipped more than once, scraping my palms and knees. After 3 hours, I finally reached the stream, but it was barely more than a trickle. Just muddy water between the rocks. And there was no trail, no sign of one, just endless trees. I made camp there that night, trying not to let frustration get the better of me. I had supplies. I had water. I wasn't in any danger yet. I'd rest, then try again in the morning. But that night was worse than any before. I heard something moving through the woods. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't even trying to be quiet. Heavy steps, branches snapping, then silence. Then again closer. It circled the camp. I stayed in my tent, clutching the revolver, waiting. I didn't sleep at all. Whatever it was, it never showed itself. But I knew it was there. The first light, I packed up and moved fast. I didn't eat, didn't stop. I picked a direction that looked downhill and kept walking. By noon, my legs were jelly. I started getting the sense that I was walking in loops. Every tree looked the same. I marked one with my knife, just to be sure, and 2 hours later, I passed it again. That's when panic set in. I sat down hard on a fallen log and let myself feel it. The tightness in my chest, the sweat, the heat of the sun. I was lost, totally lost. I pulled out my GPS, but the screen had gone black. Wouldn't turn on. I tried the solar charger, nothing. My phone was just as useless. The paper map didn't help either. It was too zoomed out, too broad. I couldn't tell where I was. I screamed, just once, loud enough to scare birds into flight. It echoed and then nothing, just the quiet rustling of leaves. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I was too exhausted. I rolled out my sleeping bag under a thick tree trunk and lay there with the revolver resting on my chest. The noises came again, closer this time, more than one set of footsteps, but again, nothing ever showed. Just the sound of something or someone watching. I ate sparingly the next few days. A bar here, a small pouch of food there. I rationed water and followed the trickle of the stream, which sometimes vanished entirely. My socks stayed wet. My feet blistered. I started hallucinating. Faces in the trees, whispers in the wind. But I knew they weren't real. I wasn't that far gone yet. On the 8th night, I found a clearing with an old fire ring, blackened stones arranged in a circle. It looked used, but not recently. I was too tired to care. I collapsed and fell asleep with the fire just smoldering. I woke up to movement, soft, careful steps. I held still, pretending to sleep, my hand on the revolver. I opened my eyes just a crack. I could see a figure, definitely a person, kneeling by my pack. They were wearing dark, baggy clothes, a hood pulled low. Couldn't see a face. They were going through my stuff, silent, methodical. I sat up fast and pointed the gun. The person bolted. No hesitation. Just vanished into the woods. Not a sound. I didn't fire. I don't know why. They had taken nothing. Everything was still there. But I couldn't stay. I walked until sunrise. I don't remember much of the 10th day. I started blacking out on my feet. Hunger, dehydration, exhaustion, who knows? I woke up face down in the mud more than once. I stopped caring about direction. I just wanted out. I started yelling more often. Not for help, just to scream. It was mid-afternoon when I finally found the road. A real road. Gravel, overgrown, but with clear tire marks. I fell to my knees and cried. I followed it for hours, limping, barely able to walk. Just as the sun dipped behind the trees, I saw a ranger station. It was old, half-rotted, clearly unused for years, but it had a satellite phone, and it worked. A chopper came the next morning. They flew me out. I weighed 19 pounds less than when I started. I had 4 infected cuts, a sprained ankle, and a fever. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. I told the ranger everything. He nodded a lot but didn't say much. Just that they didn't maintain that part of the forest anymore. Too many incidents. I asked what he meant, but he didn't answer. Just said, "You're lucky to be alive." I never went back. To this day, I don't know who that was in the clearing. I don't know if they were following me the whole time or just stumbled on me. I don't know why they didn't take anything. I don't know why they never came back. But I remember how careful their hands were, how quiet they moved, like they'd done it before. Now, every time I hear a twig snap in the woods, I think of those footsteps. Every time I look at a trail map, I check for fire roads and make sure I avoid them. I still hike sometimes. The year was 1997. I was 26 years old, tired of city noise and the non-stop hum of everyday life. So, I packed up my gear and rented a small cabin deep in the North Carolina mountains, near the Blue Ridge Parkway. The cabin sat isolated in a dense forest of tall pines and oaks, far enough from the nearest road that you could barely hear cars, if any passed by at all. The idea was to get away for 2 weeks, have time to think, write, and clear my head. I arrived late afternoon, pulling my old Chevy pickup up a narrow dirt path that twisted through the trees. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trunks and lighting up patches of golden leaves on the ground. The air was crisp, fresh, smelling of pine resin and earth. I remember thinking how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket, deep and thick. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a rusty metal roof. A front porch ran the length of the building with a few creaky wooden chairs. The door squeaked as I opened it, revealing a simple interior. A wood stove, a sagging couch, a narrow table with a battered lamp, and a small kitchen area with a sink and an old fridge. A single bed lay tucked in a corner. It smelled like damp wood and something faintly sweet, like the pine outside mixed with dust. I unloaded my things and lit a fire in the stove, the crackle and warmth settling in immediately. I had brought some canned food, a few books, a notebook, and a camera. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the woods. I planned to write every day, walk the trails, and maybe catch some trout from the nearby creek. The first few days were peaceful. I woke early, brewed coffee on the stove, and sat on the porch watching the mist drift through the trees. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of squirrels. I spent hours walking along faint trails, breathing in the cool air, letting my thoughts wander. At night, I sat by the fire, writing in my notebook, the only sound the occasional pop from burning logs and the whisper of wind through the branches. But on the 4th day, something shifted. It was late afternoon again when I decided to explore a new trail I hadn't noticed before. The path was narrower, less traveled, tangled with low branches and thick undergrowth. I had to duck and step carefully to avoid thorny bushes. The air felt heavier here, damper. I noticed broken twigs on the ground and small patches where the leaves were flattened, as if someone had been there recently. I pushed forward until I reached a small clearing beside a rocky stream. The water was clear, running fast over smooth stones. I knelt to drink some, feeling the cold water slip down my throat. When I stood up, something caught my eye near the edge of the clearing. Something dark, wedged between 2 rocks. It was a boot, a single, worn-out hiking boot, mud-caked and torn. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It looked old, maybe a few years. It didn't belong to me, that was certain. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I looked around the clearing carefully. There were no signs of a camp, no other belongings, no footprints except my own. I dropped the boot back near the rocks and decided it was best to head back. The sky was already turning gray with heavy clouds, and the wind had picked up. I moved quickly, retracing my steps through the thick forest. As I walked, I kept thinking about the boot. Who had lost it here? Was someone else out in the woods? I didn't want to believe that anyone was nearby, not after I'd felt so alone the past few days. Back at the cabin, I checked the windows and locked the door before starting a fire. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the porch boards. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. That night, I hardly slept. Every small noise, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. Around midnight, I heard something else. A faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking close to the cabin. I froze, heart pounding, ears straining in the dark. The sound stopped after a moment, and I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. The next day was colder and gray. I stayed mostly inside, reading and writing, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I told myself I was imagining things. On the sixth day, things got worse. I woke before dawn, the room cold and quiet except for a faint tapping sound at the window. I stared through the glass, but saw only darkness and the outline of trees swaying. I pulled the curtain closed tightly. Later, I went outside to fetch some firewood. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the back porch. They were boot prints about the same size as mine, but I was sure they hadn't been there yesterday. The prints led into the woods, disappearing between the trees. My pulse quickened. I had made sure to lock the cabin. Who could have left them? The nearest house was miles away. I checked all the doors and windows again, making sure everything was secure. Then I loaded my old hunting rifle I had brought for protection, just in case, and placed it near the stove where I could reach it quickly. The rest of the day I stayed inside, keeping the curtains shut, only venturing out when the sun was high. I told myself that maybe a hunter or hiker had wandered close but not seen the cabin. Maybe they were just lost. That night, the tapping at the window came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I didn't look outside. Instead, I sat by the fire, holding the rifle tight, listening to my own breathing. The tapping stopped after a while, but the sound of footsteps circling the cabin started soft, slow, deliberate. Someone was walking all around the cabin, watching me. I stayed frozen until the footsteps finally moved away into the woods. The next morning, I left the cabin for a long walk, hoping the fresh air would calm me. I followed the creek downstream, the water churning over rocks and fallen branches. After an hour, I found a small makeshift camp hidden among the trees. It was rough. Some old cans, a torn tarp, footprints everywhere. There were no people in sight. I looked around for clues. Among the scattered trash was a worn leather wallet. Inside was a faded ID, a name I didn't recognize, and a photo of a man probably in his early 30s. The wallet was dry but dusty. Suddenly, it hit me. Someone had been living rough nearby, maybe for weeks or months, hiding out in the forest. Maybe that was the person who had lost the boot. I returned to the cabin quickly, thinking about what to do. The nearest ranger station was about 20 miles away, and the road was rough. My cell phone still had no signal. I debated whether to call the police or wait it out, but I realized that the unknown person was probably watching me already, maybe even lurking close to the cabin right now. The next night was worse than the one before. The tapping came again, but this time it was joined by low, muffled noises. Shuffling, breathing, something dragging across the porch boards. My nerves were raw. I stayed awake all night, clutching the rifle, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I checked the perimeter. The back door lock was scratched and loose, and there were clear marks on the porch floor. Heavy boots dragging something large. I packed a bag quickly with food, water, some clothes, my camera, and the rifle. I left the cabin locked and slipped away before the sun was high. The hike back to the main road was exhausting. I moved quickly but cautiously, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it to a small gas station where I finally found a working phone and called the police. They arrived the next day with a search team. They combed the forest for miles, looking for signs of the person living rough. They found the camp I had seen and a few more items: old clothes, some empty bottles, and a tattered backpack. But no one. The officers told me people sometimes disappear into the woods, living off the land or hiding for various reasons. The person could still be out there or may have left quietly before the search. I never went back to that cabin after. It stayed rented out for a while, but I heard the owners eventually tore it down after more reports of trespassing and strange noises. Even years later, I remember the isolation. The cold fear of knowing someone unknown was so close, and the silence broken only by footsteps that shouldn't have been there. It taught me how fragile safety can be when you're truly alone, and how the woods hide more than just trees. I remember the first time I found that cabin. It was late September of 2018. I was 26 then, and I needed a break. The city was wearing me down. Constant noise, crowds, the endless rush. So I decided to rent a cabin somewhere quiet, away from everything. I searched online for weeks before settling on a small place in northern Vermont, near a town called St. Johnsbury. It wasn't fancy, just a rustic, old cabin set deep in the woods beside a lake. The pictures online looked peaceful. Lots of trees, water nearby, and an old dirt road leading up to it. Perfect for what I wanted: silence and space to think. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive up had been long but beautiful. The trees were starting to change colors, bright reds and golds mixing with deep greens. The sky was overcast but calm. When I pulled up to the cabin, I saw it was smaller than I expected. It looked more like a big shed than a house. The wood was faded, cracked in places, and the roof sagged a little. Still, the porch was solid, and the lake was visible through the trees just 100 feet away or so. I got out of the car and stretched, breathing in the cold, sharp air. It smelled like pine and wet earth. The sun was dropping behind the hills, making the shadows stretch long and dark. I carried my bags inside. The cabin had a single room with a small kitchen corner, a wood stove, and a bed pushed against one wall. There was no internet, no TV, just a few old books on the shelf and some kitchen tools on the counter. That night, I made a fire in the stove and cooked some canned beans I had brought. The flames crackled, casting flickering light on the wooden walls. Outside, the forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt good being alone, no distractions. I lay on the bed, the windows open a crack to let the cool air in, listening to the faint splash of water from the lake. The quiet was deep, almost heavy, but I liked it. The next day I woke early. The sun was weak behind thick clouds. I wrapped myself in a sweater and walked down the path to the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the gray sky like glass. I found a fallen log to sit on and stared out at the stillness. No boats, no people, just me and the water. The air was chilly, and the smell of wet leaves mixed with damp earth. A few birds called from the trees, but it was mostly quiet. I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. The forest was dense, mostly pine with patches of birch and maple. The ground was soft with moss and fallen needles. I walked for hours, following animal tracks and looking for signs of wildlife. Occasionally I heard twigs snap or leaves rustle, but never saw anything bigger than squirrels or birds. The woods felt peaceful but also vast, like they could hide anything. That evening, I made another fire and cooked a simple dinner of rice and canned vegetables. As darkness fell, the cabin felt colder. The stove helped, but I noticed the wind outside picking up. The trees creaked and moaned, and the lake lapped quietly against the shore. I read one of the books, an old nature guide, until the fire burned low and I went to bed. The next few days passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. I woke with the light, ate simple meals, walked the woods and sat by the lake. Sometimes clouds hid the sun, and rain came in light showers. Other times, the air was crisp and clear. I felt more relaxed than I had in years. No calls, no emails, just the raw, real world. But then something started to feel off. On the fourth day, while walking through the woods, I noticed the path near the cabin had changed. The dirt road that led from the main forest road to the cabin was clear and worn, but now there were new footprints in the mud. Not my own, and they weren't animal tracks. They looked fresh, deep, like someone had walked there recently. I stopped and studied them, but they stopped just a few feet from the cabin. There were no footprints going back the way they came, as if the person had vanished near the cabin. My heart beat faster, but I told myself it was probably a hunter or another hiker passing by. This area was popular in the fall for hunting season. Still, I didn't hear any voices or gunshots. The woods were silent. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard noises outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind again. Branches brushing the windows, leaves scraping the walls. But then I heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, walking around the cabin's perimeter. I stayed frozen, trying to tell if I was imagining things. The steps stopped near the back door, then moved away again. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed by the window watching the dark woods. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the only light was from the stove's embers. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy for an animal. The next morning, I checked the back door. The latch was still locked, but the doorframe had fresh scratch marks, deep and jagged. I didn't think any animal could make marks like that, not that size. I felt a chill run through me, but I tried to focus on practical things. Maybe some kid had been messing around or a hunter trying to find shelter. I told myself I'd call the rental owner and ask about it, but the cabin had no phone or internet, so I couldn't. I decided to stay inside more during the day, locking every door and window I could. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, even though I never saw anyone. I kept my phone charged, but I had no signal. On the 6th day, something worse happened. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a loud bang on the front door. I jumped, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The bang came again, louder this time, like someone trying to break in. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove and crept to the door, ready to defend myself. I peered out a small window beside the door. The porch was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone there. The wind had picked up, and branches shook wildly. I opened the door slowly and looked around. Nothing. The woods were silent except for the rustling trees. I closed the door and locked it again, my hands shaking. Whoever had hit the door wasn't outside anymore, or maybe never had been. I sat down and tried to calm myself, but the fear stayed with me. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. The wind howling, the creaking wood, the distant splash of the lake. I kept the stove burning all night for warmth and light. I didn't want to look outside. The next morning, I found something that made me more afraid than anything else. When I opened the front door, I saw a note pinned to the wooden frame with a rusty nail. The paper was old, torn, and wet from the rain, but I could read the words scrawled in rough handwriting. "Get out." I looked around, but there was no one. The woods were still. My hands trembled as I tore the note down and shoved it in my pocket. I knew I had to leave, but the car was stuck in mud from the rain, and the road was narrow and wet. I tried to start the engine, but it barely turned over. I spent hours pushing and rocking the car until it finally moved a few feet. I decided to walk to the main road and find help. I packed some food and water and locked the cabin door behind me. The woods seemed even darker now, the shadows thicker, as if hiding eyes watching me. I kept my eyes on the path, my heart racing. I walked for nearly 2 hours before I reached a small highway. I found a gas station and called for a tow truck. I told them to come get the car and promised to return for the cabin keys later. On the drive back to the city, I thought about everything that had happened. No one ever explained why someone was watching me or why they left that note. Maybe it was a warning from a local, or maybe a dangerous person lived nearby. Whatever the reason, I knew I was lucky to get away. After that trip, I never went back to that cabin. The pictures on the rental site were taken years ago, before the place started falling apart. I don't know if the owner ever told anyone about the strange visitor or the threats, but I kept the story to myself. Sometimes, late at night, I still remember the feeling of being alone in those woods, surrounded by silence that felt too heavy, as if something unseen was waiting just beyond the trees. But I'm okay now. I learned to trust my instincts, to listen when something feels wrong. The forest is beautiful, but it's also wild and unpredictable. Not every place is safe, even if it looks peaceful. Sometimes the scariest things don't have a clear answer. No ghosts or monsters, just real danger hiding in shadows. That trip taught me more than I expected. I still love the quiet of the woods, but now I respect their silence in a different way. I know when to leave, and I know that some places aren't meant for everyone. It was the fall of 1999 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of the city and retreat to a small cabin I had rented in the northern woods of Vermont. I was 27 then, working a dead-end office job that drained every bit of energy and will from me. The plan was simple: spend a week alone in the wilderness to clear my head and maybe write a little, though the truth was I wasn't sure what I was trying to find out there. The cabin was old but sturdy, a one-room wooden shack tucked deep into the forest, about 3 miles off the nearest dirt road. No cell signal, no internet, just me and the trees. The drive up was long, a slow, winding path through golden and red leaves that covered the ground like a thick, crunchy carpet. The air was sharp, cold, and smelled like wet pine and earth. I remember pulling up to the gravel clearing just before sunset, the sky painted in bruised purples and oranges. The cabin sat quietly beside a small frozen creek that gurgled faintly, its water thin but alive despite the cold creeping in. I spent the first hour unpacking. Inside, the cabin was dim but clean. A wood stove sat cold in the corner, and a simple cot with a thin mattress was pressed against one wall. A small kitchen counter with a sink and an old gas stove was opposite a window that looked out into the darkening woods. The walls were made of thick logs, stained by years of rain and wind, with gaps filled in by moss and hardened clay. The floor creaked with every step, and the only source of light inside was a hanging bulb that flickered whenever the wind gusted. I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. Peace because the city noise was gone, replaced by the sound of wind through branches and distant bird calls. Unease because the place felt isolated in a way that made me hyper-aware of every small sound. The wind rattling the window panes, the creek's faint burble, the scurrying of unseen animals in the underbrush. Each noise seemed amplified in the silence. That first night, I built a fire in the stove and sat by it, my hands warming against the iron plate. I hadn't brought much in the way of food, just some canned beans, bread, and a few energy bars. The cold seeped into the cabin's corners, and despite the fire, I wrapped myself in a thick blanket, watching shadows flicker on the walls. Sleep came hard. The unfamiliar sounds of the woods filled the night, and the silence between them was louder than anything. I remember waking up several times, feeling like something was out there just beyond the window watching. But when I looked, there was only darkness and the occasional movement of branches. Morning came slow and pale. The sun barely pierced the thick canopy of trees. I brewed coffee on the old stove, the smell grounding me. Outside, the woods stretched endlessly, a mix of evergreens and bare maples. The forest floor was littered with damp leaves and the occasional broken twig, like someone or something had passed through recently. I spent the next few days walking the trails, exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were alive with small animals, chipmunks, squirrels, the occasional deer, but always just out of reach. The deeper I went, the quieter it felt. No birds, no rustling. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. On the third day, I noticed something odd near the creek. Footprints. Large, heavy prints pressed into the muddy bank, heading upstream. They were too big to be human, wider and deeper, like someone wearing oversized boots. I followed the prints for a while, curiosity pushing me forward, until they stopped abruptly near a fallen tree. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started locking the cabin door at night and keeping my small pocket knife close by. Still, nothing happened, just the constant feeling of eyes watching from the dark. The fourth night was the worst. Around midnight, a noise woke me up. At first, it was soft, a low scraping, like nails dragging over wood. Then came a series of heavy thumps against the side of the cabin. My heart hammered in my chest. I stayed frozen under my blanket, listening to the sound circle the cabin, stopping briefly outside the window, then moving to the back wall. I wanted to believe it was a large animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar, but the thumps were deliberate, not random. I didn't dare look outside. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my knife, watching the dark window, waiting for the dawn. When morning finally came, The world outside was calm, almost serene. I went out to check for damage and found deep claw marks gouged into the cabin's wooden siding. Nearby, fresh broken branches littered the ground, and a large patch of disturbed earth indicated something big had been digging or pawing there. I debated leaving immediately but didn't want to admit defeat. Besides, the nearest town was miles away, and the roads were not in great shape for my old rental car. So, I stayed but made sure to keep a fire burning all night, using every scrap of wood I had to build a bright blaze. The next day, I packed a small bag with essentials and hiked back toward the main dirt road, hoping to find a ranger station or at least a passing vehicle. After about an hour, I stumbled on a small, abandoned hunting cabin. The door was hanging off its hinges, and inside, it smelled of mold and rot, but it offered a brief shelter from the biting wind. There was an old, rusted rifle leaning against a corner. I didn't know anything about guns, but the sight of it gave me a strange, uneasy comfort. I took it with me, unsure if it even worked, but at least it was something. That night, back at my cabin, I slept lightly, the rifle by my side. The noises returned, louder and more frequent. Scraping, thumping, sometimes a heavy breathing outside the walls. I was terrified but forced myself to stay calm. I remembered a survival article I'd read about animals and people being scared of fire and loud noises. I banged pots and shouted into the darkness, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. Nothing happened, only silence after the noise died. On the 5th day, the prints returned, closer this time, pressed into the soft soil just a few feet from the cabin steps. I could see the deep impressions of heavy boots, and between them, smaller, lighter tracks. Human tracks. I realized then that whatever had been circling the cabin wasn't an animal. It was a person. The thought sent a new kind of chill through me. I was alone in the woods, miles from help, and someone was watching me, waiting. That evening, I found the small generator I'd packed for emergencies had run out of fuel. The cabin was plunged into near darkness, except for the dying fire in the stove and the moonlight filtering through the window. I lit every candle I had and placed them near the door and windows, hoping the light would deter whoever was outside. But the noises didn't stop. At one point, I heard the door handle jiggle, slow and deliberate, but the door held firm. The wood was old but thick, and I'd wedged a heavy chair against it. Sleep was impossible. On the 6th day, I woke to silence. The forest was still and quiet. I packed everything I had and decided to leave before nightfall. The longer I stayed, the more danger I felt. As I stepped outside, I saw fresh footprints leading away from the cabin. They disappeared into the trees. I followed them cautiously, clutching the rifle. The trail led downhill toward a small dirt road. I hurried, heart pounding, until I saw a pair of headlights up ahead. I waved frantically until the car slowed and stopped. It was a couple heading back to town who agreed to give me a ride. Back in town, safe and warm, I reported the footprints and the strange noises to the local sheriff. They suspected an illegal poacher or a drifter living rough in the woods nearby. The area had seen an uptick in trespassers lately, and my cabin was probably an unwelcome intrusion. I never went back. It was the summer of 1997 when I first decided to escape the chaos of city life for a while. I was 27 then, worn out from a string of stressful jobs and restless nights. The city noise never stopped. The streets were always crowded, and the pressure to keep up with everything around me was unbearable. I needed a break, some quiet, something real. So I rented a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, near a lake called Clearwater. The place was remote. No phone, no internet, barely any electricity. Perfect for what I wanted. The cabin was nothing fancy but solid. A one-room wooden structure with a small porch, a stone fireplace, and a tin roof that creaked when the wind blew. There was a small kitchen area with a wood stove and a sink that worked only when the water pump was turned on. The landlord told me there was a small generator, but it was finicky and best used only at night. I packed my old backpack, filled with clothes, food, a couple of books, and basic camping gear. I wasn't expecting to be out here long, maybe a week, just to clear my head. The drive there was long and winding. From Minneapolis, I took a narrow highway north, then turned off onto a gravel road that grew rougher and more narrow with every mile. The trees got taller and denser, blocking out the sun in patches. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was already shading toward dusk. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was quiet in a way the city never was. No hum of traffic, no distant voices. Just birds calling and the rustle of leaves. I spent the first night settling in. I built a fire in the stone fireplace, cooked some canned beans and rice on the wood stove, and lay on the creaky cot looking out the small window at the dark forest. I could hear an owl hoot somewhere, and the occasional snap of a twig. It was peaceful but also a little lonely. I didn't mind that. The silence helped me breathe again. The next morning I woke early. The sun filtered through the trees in golden streaks. I walked down to the lake, just a few hundred feet from the cabin. The water was cold and clear, reflecting the sky and the towering pines. I dipped my hand in and felt the chill. I spent the day exploring the nearby trails, noting where berries grew and where the ground was soft with moss. I saw tracks, deer mostly, but something else too, bigger, harder to tell. I felt watched sometimes, but that was probably my mind playing tricks, I thought. For the next few days, I settled into a quiet routine. Morning walks to the lake, collecting firewood, reading books, writing a little in my notebook. Nights were spent by the fire, the only light in the black woods. The generator would hum briefly around midnight, but mostly I relied on lanterns and candles. The isolation was strange but not unpleasant. I felt myself slowing down, my heartbeat steadying. On the fourth day, something changed. I was out gathering firewood near a steep slope a few hundred yards from the cabin when I noticed strange markings on the trees. At first, they looked like scratches, deep gouges in the bark, some crossed with strange lines. They were fresh, the wood beneath still pale and raw. I couldn't make sense of them. They didn't look like animal claw marks, and they didn't match anything I'd ever seen before. A creeping sense of unease settled in my chest. I dropped the sticks I was carrying and stared at the marks for a long time. I thought about going back to the cabin, but a part of me was curious. I followed the trail of marked trees uphill. The ground was rocky and uneven, and the trees grew thicker. The scratches became more frequent, some wrapped in tight spirals around the trunks, others carved into crude shapes that vaguely resembled symbols or letters. As I walked, the forest grew quieter. No birds sang, no wind stirred the leaves. The heavy silence pressed in on me. I stopped several times, listening for any sound. My own breathing, a distant animal, anything. But there was only stillness. Suddenly, I heard a faint crunch of leaves behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing except the dense trees and shadows. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to calm down. It was probably just a squirrel or some other small animal. I made my way back to the cabin quickly, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. When I reached the porch, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. I sat by the fire, trying to shake off the unease, but the scratches haunted my mind. Who or what could have made those marks? Why here? That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside the cabin, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, made me jump. I kept the lantern lit and the fireplace burning. I listened for the generator's hum, but it didn't come. On the fifth day, I decided to explore further around the slope where I found the marks. I wanted to understand what I had stumbled upon. I packed some food, my knife, and a small first aid kit just in case. I left the cabin mid-morning. As I walked back to the marked trees, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt, large, heavy, with a shape that was human but too big to be mine. They led toward the deeper woods. The prints were too large for any normal person, and the stride was long and steady, like whoever made them had been walking here often. I followed them slowly, trying to keep calm. The forest thickened, and the canopy blocked out most of the sun. After about half a mile, the trail opened into a small clearing. In the middle was a crudely built wooden structure. It looked like a rough shelter, maybe made recently. The wood was fresh, not weathered like the trees around it. There were signs of fire, charred logs, ash. I crouched behind a fallen tree and observed. I saw no one, but it was clear someone had been here, maybe living here for a while. There were empty cans, scraps of cloth, and what looked like food wrappers scattered near the fire pit. Whoever this was, they weren't just passing through. The feeling of unease turned into something colder, sharper. I wondered why no one else had found this place. Was this person dangerous? Homeless? Lost? I took some pictures with my old camera, careful not to make noise, then decided to leave. The sun was already low, and I didn't want to be out here after dark. Back at the cabin, I locked up and checked my supplies. I felt the cabin's walls closing in, and I realized I wasn't just out here for peace anymore. I was out here with something unknown. That night, the wind picked up, and the roof creaked louder than before. I heard faint noises outside, branches scraping, footsteps maybe. I kept the lantern close, gripping my knife. The noises stopped and started again several times, each time closer to the cabin. I stayed awake, heart racing, waiting for something that never came. The next morning, I noticed something alarming. The front porch was disturbed, footprints in the soft earth, large and heavy again. They led away into the woods. Someone had been here outside my door. I was certain of it. For the next 2 days, I stayed inside during the day, only going out at dusk to gather wood, always armed and alert. The markings on the trees increased around the cabin, almost like warnings. More symbols scratched into bark, trees bent or broken in strange ways. I realized I was not alone. Something or someone was living in these woods, watching, marking, maybe protecting their territory. But it wasn't a ghost or a legend. It was a person, someone who didn't want me here. On the 7th day, just before dawn, I woke to a loud banging on the cabin door. My heart froze. I hid behind the door with my knife. The banging stopped, then a low grinding sound followed. Something heavy was pushed against the door. I heard breathing, deep, slow, steady, the kind of breathing a large man might have. I waited for a long time, silent and still. Eventually, the sounds stopped. When I finally looked outside, there was nothing but fresh footprints leading away, disappearing into the darkness. I knew then I couldn't stay. The cabin, the forest, the quiet had all turned into a trap. I packed everything quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't want to look back. By the time the sun was fully up, I was driving back down the gravel road. The city noise was already starting to fill the air on the radio, and I welcomed it. The woods stayed behind me, silent and secret. I never found out who had made those marks or who had been living in that shelter. The police didn't take me seriously when I told them about it. They said it was probably a homeless person or maybe someone hiding from the law. But I know what I felt. Something real, dangerous, and very human. That trip taught me that the wild isn't just empty space or peaceful nature. It can be a place where people live hidden, unseen, and sometimes watching. And sometimes it's best to leave it that way. It was the summer of 1998, and I was 27 years old when I decided to take a break from my usual life in the city and head into the wilderness for some solitude. I found a small cabin to rent in the remote forests of northern Minnesota, near a tiny town called Willow Creek. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, far from any neighbors or roads. The only way to get there was by a rough dirt trail that twisted through thick pine trees and patches of wild blueberry bushes. The idea was to spend a full 2 weeks alone, away from work, phones, and people, just me and the silence of the forest. I had been working nonstop for months at a small software company in Minneapolis, stuck in front of a computer all day, and the stress was getting to me. The city noise, the crowded subway, the endless meetings, it all felt suffocating. I needed to breathe, to clear my head, and to find something real. I wanted to be away from everything for a while, just living simply, cooking over a fire, reading and hiking. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. Built in the early 1960s, it was a single-story wooden structure with faded green paint peeling off the walls. It sat beside a small lake called Mirror Lake, named so because the water was usually so still it reflected the sky perfectly. The cabin had a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a propane stove, a tiny bathroom with a hand pump for water, and a loft with a bed. There was no electricity, no running water except for the lake and a hand pump well outside. It was basic, but it had everything I needed. The first day I arrived, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with unease. I parked my old blue Toyota near the trailhead and hauled my backpack and a heavy cooler filled with food down the path to the cabin. The forest was thick with tall spruce and pine trees. The air smelled like earth and resin, and the ground was soft with pine needles. Birds chirped overhead, and I spotted a couple of squirrels darting between the branches. When I reached the cabin, I set down my gear and took a long look around. The lake stretched out in front of me, calm and clear, surrounded by the dense forest. There were no sounds of cars or planes, just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a loon somewhere far away. I opened the cabin door, and the smell of old wood mixed with faint mildew hit me. Dust particles floated in the sunlight coming through the windows. Inside, the cabin was cold and quiet. I went straight to the fireplace and stacked some dry logs from a nearby pile. I lit a fire and watched the flames crackle and pop, feeling a little better already. I unpacked my food, mostly canned beans, rice, dried fruit, and some fresh vegetables I bought from the last town I passed through. I boiled water on the stove for coffee and settled down in a wooden chair by the window. That first night, I lay in the loft bed under a thick wool blanket. The silence was intense. Without city noise to mask the sounds, every rustle of leaves, every creak of wood, and every bird call felt amplified. At times, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin, but when I looked, there was nothing but shadows cast by moonlight filtering through the trees. The next morning, I woke early and went to the lake. The water was icy cold when I dipped my hands in, but refreshing. I rinsed my face and drank some fresh water from the well pump outside. The day was clear and warm, with a gentle breeze moving the tops of the trees. I spent the day hiking along the shore, finding wild berries and marking trails on a map I brought. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I woke with the sun, cooked simple meals over the fire, read old paperbacks I brought, and spent hours walking through the woods or sitting by the lake. I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The forest was alive in its quiet way. Birds built nests, insects buzzed, and the wind whispered through the branches. But as the days went on, I began to notice small things that unsettled me. The first was the footprints. One morning after a rainstorm, I saw strange footprints in the mud near the lake shore. Not mine. They looked like boots but older, worn down, as if someone had walked there recently. The prints led from the trees to the water and then disappeared. I checked my map, trying to figure out if there were any other cabins or houses nearby. According to the map, no one else was supposed to be close. The nearest town was miles away, and no trails led directly here except the one I came down. Still, I felt like I wasn't alone. The next evening, I was sitting by the fire when I heard a branch snap not far from the cabin. My heart jumped, and I sat very still, listening. There was a faint rustling in the bushes, then silence. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I started to notice odd things inside the cabin too. One morning, my coffee cup was in a different spot than I remembered leaving it. A small tool I had put on the table was missing for a few hours and then found on the floor. Nothing seemed to be damaged or broken, just little signs that someone or something had been moving around when I wasn't paying attention. By the 6th day, I felt nervous enough to keep a large kitchen knife close to me at all times. I also started locking the cabin door, even though I didn't know who I was locking out. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help or check messages. I thought about leaving, but a part of me was stubborn. I wanted to prove I could handle this alone. On the 7th day, the unease grew. I woke before dawn and noticed fresh footprints in the soft ground near the cabin's back door. They were bigger than mine, and they led into the woods, then stopped abruptly. I spent the day watching the edge of the forest from the cabin window, but I didn't see anyone. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind picked up, and the trees groaned and rattled in the darkness. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud bang against the cabin wall. It sounded like something heavy hitting the wood. I froze, listening. Silence. I grabbed the knife and moved cautiously toward the door, trying to keep quiet. Outside, the forest was pitch black except for a faint glow from the stars. I looked around but saw nothing. The smell of damp earth and pine was thick. I stayed by the door for a long time, waiting, but no more sounds came. Eventually, I went back to bed but couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. The next day, I found fresh footprints again. This time, they led to the lake's edge and then followed the shoreline, disappearing into the trees on the other side. I tried not to panic, but my hands shook as I gathered my things. I made a decision to leave the cabin the following morning. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire low and the knife within reach. Around midnight, I heard movement outside, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I pressed myself against the wall opposite the door and tried to control my breathing. The steps stopped suddenly, then a faint scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the ground. Then silence again. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the pale light spread through the trees. When the sun finally rose, I packed everything quickly, double-checked the locks, and headed back down the trail to my car. The forest felt colder and less welcoming as I walked away. When I reached the trailhead, I locked the car doors and sat inside, breathing heavily. Back in the city, the feeling of safety returned slowly. I told myself it was probably a local hunter or a camper who didn't mean any harm. Maybe they were curious or lost. There were reports of strange men lurking around cabins in the area, but nothing ever proven. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, at night, when the city noise fades, I think about those footsteps in the mud and the eyes I never saw but felt watching me. And I remember that in the quiet woods, far from everything, you aren't always alone. And sometimes the scariest things are the ones you don't see. I didn't plan to spend the night in that cabin, but sometimes plans go sideways. It was late October, 2013, when I found myself deep in the forests of northern Maine, near a small town called Millinocket. I was 29 years old then, on a solo hiking trip after quitting my job in Boston. I needed space and time to think. I packed light, a backpack with some food, a basic sleeping bag, water, and a flashlight. No phone signal out there, of course. The trees stretched tall and thick, their branches bare or almost bare, the wind cold enough to bite through my jacket. I started out early that morning from a trailhead off the main highway. The trail I chose was less traveled, not marked well on any map I had. I wanted to see the real forest, untouched by crowds. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of dry leaves underfoot, the distant call of a crow, and the steady rhythm of my boots on dirt and fallen twigs. The sun was already low by mid-afternoon, turning the sky an eerie orange, casting long shadows between the trees. As the day faded, I realized I had lost track of time and direction. The trail markers were faint or missing, and I wasn't sure if I had veered off the main path. My watch said it was after 5 p.m., and the forest was darkening fast. I decided to keep moving west, hoping to find a clearing or maybe a road. But instead, the woods grew thicker, the underbrush denser. The forest floor was damp, and the cold seeped through my shoes and socks. I felt a creeping unease, but told myself it was just the chill. Then I saw it. A small cabin hidden behind a cluster of pines, almost swallowed by the shadows. It wasn't marked on my map, but it looked old. Weathered wood, a sagging roof covered in moss, a chimney that looked long and used. The windows were dirty, clouded over, but I could see curtains inside, yellowed and torn. A thin trail of smoke curled faintly from the chimney, which made me hesitate. Someone had been here recently, or maybe still was. My instincts said to keep moving, but the cold was unbearable. I needed shelter for the night. I approached cautiously, scanning the surroundings for any signs of people or animals. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees that blocked the fading light. The door was closed, but not locked. The old wood creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale but dry. Dust covered most surfaces, but the place was surprisingly intact. There was a small stove with ashes cold and gray in the firebox, a rickety table with peeling paint, and a few mismatched chairs. The floorboards creaked under my feet. I found some old blankets in a cupboard and dragged them out, hoping to stay warm. I gathered some dry twigs and branches from outside and managed to light a fire in the stove using a box of matches I always carried. The flames flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin was small, maybe 10 by 15 feet, but it felt like a refuge from the cold darkness outside. As night fell, the forest outside turned black. I could hear the wind moaning through the trees and the occasional snap of a twig. Somewhere far off, an animal howled, maybe a coyote or a fox. I sat by the fire, watching the flames, feeling the warmth on my face. I thought about my job back in Boston, the people I left behind, the mess I was trying to escape. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the old windows, but then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the dead leaves. My heart jumped. I stood up, the firelight making my shadow stretch tall on the opposite wall. I grabbed a heavy piece of firewood, ready to defend myself if I had to. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and careful. No shouting, no calls, just the sound of someone walking around. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to stay calm, listening closely. The cabin door shook slightly as if someone pushed it, but it didn't open. I whispered to myself that maybe it was a hunter or a lost traveler like me, but the silence and the slow steps didn't feel right. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps retreated into the darkness. I stayed awake for most of the night, the fire dying down, the cabin cold again. I thought about what I would do if whoever was outside tried to get in again. I wished I had a phone or a weapon. Morning came with a faint light through the grimy windows. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing. The footprints in the soft earth were clear, big boots, heavy tread. They didn't circle back, just walked around and then disappeared into the forest. Whoever it was, they were alone. I packed my things quickly, deciding to leave the cabin behind. But as I moved back into the woods, I kept hearing faint noises, snapping branches, whispers of movement. I stayed alert, walking briskly, trying to keep the cabin in sight in case I needed to return. The forest grew brighter as the sun rose higher. I followed a faint dirt road I found that led back toward the town. Hours later, I reached a ranger station, where I reported the cabin and the strange visitor. The ranger told me that the cabin was known but abandoned for years. People occasionally squatted there, sometimes hunters, sometimes people passing through. They warned me to be careful in those woods after dark. Looking back, I understood what had kept me alert and uneasy that night. It wasn't ghosts or shadows, but the real, raw danger of being alone in the wilderness with someone else's presence unknown. Someone possibly watching, waiting, or passing through. The forest is silent most of the time, but when it isn't, it can remind you how vulnerable you really are. I left Millinocket the next day, my thoughts heavy but clearer. I had faced that cold night and the unknown footsteps, and I survived. The cabin stayed behind me, a silent witness to that night's fear and relief. It was the winter of 1998, just after the Christmas rush, when I decided to get away for a few days. I was 29 then, working in a small town in northern Vermont called Stowe. I wanted nothing more than silence, peace, and the cold air of the mountains. The city and my job were wearing me down, and I needed time to think, to reset. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, near a place called Smuggler's Notch. It was the kind of spot you only get to if you know the back roads or have a real map. No cell signal, no internet, just forest and snow. The cabin was old, built maybe in the 1950s with thick logs and a stone chimney. It had a tiny kitchen, a small living room with a wood stove, and one bedroom with a bed that creaked when you moved. The windows were frosted over, but I could see the tall pine trees bending under the weight of fresh snow. The road to the cabin was a narrow dirt path, barely cleared, and the owner told me to be careful driving after dark. I arrived just as the sun was setting. The sky was a pale orange, fading quickly into gray. I brought a backpack with essentials: canned food, a few books, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and plenty of warm clothes. The cabin smelled like old pine and wood smoke, but clean. I felt the weight of the silence settle in around me like a heavy blanket. The first night, I made a fire in the wood stove, heating the small room while snow quietly fell outside. The crackling of the flames was the only sound apart from the wind brushing against the cabin walls. I cooked some soup on the stove, ate slowly, and then went to bed early. The cold crept into the cabin overnight despite the stove, making me pull the thick blankets tighter around me. The next morning, I woke to a world coated in snow. The trees were white, the path outside invisible. I went outside with my boots and coat, stepping carefully on the crust of frozen snow. The air was sharp and clean. I wandered through the woods a bit, taking in the quiet. No birds, no animals, just snow crunching beneath my feet. By the afternoon, I realized the weather was getting worse. The wind picked up, throwing snow in wild sheets that blurred my vision. The sky turned a dull, heavy gray. I checked the small radio I'd brought along, hoping for a weather update, but there was nothing but static. I didn't have cell service here, and the nearest town was over 15 miles away. I started to feel uneasy, but I told myself the cabin was safe. It was built for winter. I went back inside, stacked more wood in the stove, and made another fire. Outside, the storm began in earnest. Snow fell thick and fast, piling up against the windows. The wind howled like a wild animal. I pulled my chair close to the stove and tried to read, but the cold seeped in where the window frames didn't seal perfectly. That night, the power went out. I knew that would happen eventually. The cabin ran on a small generator, but with the storm, the fuel line must have frozen. I found my flashlight and lit a few candles. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The silence was absolute except for the roar of the wind outside. That was when I heard it. First, I thought it was just the wind, a scraping, slow and deliberate, coming from the side of the cabin. I froze and listened. It sounded like someone, or something, was trying to move the snow away from the wall. A scratch here, a soft scrape there. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox trapped in the snow. But the sound kept coming, steady and patient. It lasted for maybe 5 minutes before stopping. I waited longer, heart pounding. Nothing. I decided to check outside. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and carefully stepped into the snow. The wind hit me like a wall, biting cold and blinding snowflakes. I circled the cabin, shining the light on the snowbank near the side door. There, I saw fresh footprints in the snow, not from any animal I recognized. They were human. My throat went dry. I scanned the dark woods around the cabin, but no one was there. No sounds except the wind and the distant creak of trees bending in the storm. I hurried back inside, locking the doors and windows. The thought that someone could be outside in the storm, so close to me, made my skin crawl. I had no idea who it could be or what they wanted. The next day, the storm was worse. Snow drifted up to the roof, the wind screaming constantly. I rationed my food carefully, drinking only small sips of water I melted from snow over the stove. I stayed close to the fire, wrapped in blankets, my mind spinning with worry. What if the person outside came back? What if the storm cut me off here for days? Around mid-afternoon, I heard it again. This time it was louder, something banging against the cabin walls, trying to get in. I froze in terror. My heart hammered as I moved quietly to the kitchen, grabbing a heavy cast iron skillet. I held it like a weapon, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. The banging stopped after a few minutes, but then I heard footsteps crunching away through the snow, heading toward the back of the cabin where the woods were thickest. I waited, tense and silent. That night I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. The wind, the snow falling from the roof, branches scraping the windows. I stayed awake, clutching the skillet, listening. The next morning, I saw tracks outside, barely visible under fresh snow, but they were still there. They showed someone had walked around the cabin during the night. My stomach twisted. I had to do something. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. The road was blocked by snowdrifts at least 6 feet high, and the storm wasn't stopping. No one knew I was here except the cabin owner, and they didn't come by during winter. That afternoon, as the storm eased for a moment, I decided to try and hike out. I packed what little food I had left, filled my water bottle, and took my thickest coat and boots. I left a note on the table just in case. Stepping outside was like walking into a wall of cold. The snow was knee-deep and the wind still whipped. I followed the faintest trail I could find leading away from the cabin toward the main road. Hours passed. My legs burned, and my face stung from the cold. I kept telling myself to keep going, to stay calm. But the forest was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. No birds, no animals, no signs of life. After about 3 miles, I stopped to rest. I was exhausted and cold to the bone. As I sat on a fallen log, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, steady. My heart stopped. I turned around slowly, shining my flashlight in the direction the sound came from. There was a man standing maybe 30 feet away, half covered in snow, wearing a dark coat and a knit cap. His face was hard to see in the dim light. He didn't say anything, just stared. Fear hit me like a truck. I gripped my flashlight tight and backed away. He started walking toward me. I turned and ran, stumbling through the snow. My breath came out in painful gasps. I had no idea where I was going, just away from him. The snow swallowed my footprints as I ran, and soon I was lost. I kept running until my legs gave out, and I collapsed in the snow. The man caught up, grabbed me roughly by the arm, and dragged me to my feet. I struggled, but his grip was iron. He pushed me toward a dark thicket. I felt hopeless, cold, and scared beyond anything I'd ever known. Then something unexpected happened. A loud noise rang out. A shout from far away, and the man froze. He looked around, panic in his eyes, and then he ran off into the woods, disappearing like a shadow. I was left alone, shivering and trembling, but alive. I waited, listening for any sign of him returning. After an hour, I slowly made my way back to the cabin, following the faint trail I had left. Back inside, I locked every door and window and piled heavy furniture in front of them. I lit the fire and huddled close, exhausted and shaking. The next morning, the storm finally cleared. The sun came out weakly, lighting the snow-covered trees. I packed the last of my things, made sure the fire was out, and started the walk to the nearest road where I hoped to find help. I was lucky. After a few hours, a snowplow passed, and I flagged it down. The driver took me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They told me that the man who had tried to follow me was a local drifter, known for sneaking into cabins and causing trouble. They caught him later that day, hiding in an abandoned shed near the road. That experience stayed with me for years. The fear, the cold, the silence of the woods, and the knowledge that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but real people in desperate situations. I never went back to that cabin, but I'm grateful I made it out. I learned that survival isn't just about fighting the weather or being strong. It's about keeping your wits, trusting your instincts, and holding on to hope, even when everything seems lost. The sky was a dull gray when I pulled off the highway onto the winding dirt road that led to the cabin. It was October 2003, early autumn, and I had taken a week off work to get away from the city. I was 28, living alone in Seattle, and desperate for a break from the noise, the rush, the constant hum of life that left me exhausted but restless. The cabin was a rental, deep in the woods of northern Oregon, about a 2-hour drive from Portland. I had found it online, an old wooden structure sitting on the edge of a thick forest near a small, quiet lake. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the smell. It was a mix of wet wood, damp earth, and something faintly like smoke, like the cabin had been closed up for a long time and was only now waking up. The dirt road ended in a small clearing where the cabin stood, surrounded by tall pines whose tops disappeared into a thick fog that had rolled in overnight. The cabin itself was rough but sturdy, built maybe in the 70s, with peeling brown paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dusty, clouded with grime and spiderwebs. I parked my car next to the porch and grabbed my backpack and cooler. The air was cold, the kind that creeps through your jacket and makes you aware of every small breath you take. Inside, the cabin smelled of stale air and old wood. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls were lined with wood paneling that had yellowed with age. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a worn-out table with 2 chairs, and a living space with a threadbare couch and a fireplace full of cold ashes. I dropped my bags and went to the windows, looking out into the forest. The fog had thickened, blurring the trees and hiding the lake from view. The cabin had no cell signal, no internet, and no TV, exactly what I wanted. I was here to disconnect, to find some peace. After unpacking my things, I went to explore the surroundings. A narrow path led from the back of the cabin down to the lake. The water was still, dark, and cold-looking. Leaves floated on its surface, and the air was so quiet I could hear the faint splash of a fish breaking the water far away. I spent the day unpacking, chopping some wood for the fireplace, and trying to get comfortable. The cabin was simple but had what I needed: a bed, a small bathroom with a shower, and a wood stove to heat the place if it got too cold at night. As evening came, the fog grew thicker and crept closer to the cabin. I lit the stove, filling the room with a faint smell of smoke and warmth. Outside, the woods were alive with sounds: rustling leaves, distant birds, the occasional snap of a twig. It was calming but also made me aware of how isolated I was. No other houses, no people, nothing but trees stretching for miles. I cooked some canned soup on the stove and ate quietly by the window. The light inside the cabin was dim, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the fog seemed to press against the glass, softening the edges of the trees and hiding the world beyond. That night, I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds outside. The wind whispered through the branches, and at one point, I heard a low, distant howl, maybe a coyote or a wolf. It wasn't frightening, just a reminder of the wildness surrounding me. I fell asleep with the stove warming the room and the fog wrapping the cabin like a blanket. The next day was clear, bright with sunlight piercing through the trees. I decided to hike deeper into the forest, taking the path that followed the edge of the lake. The trail was narrow, lined with ferns and moss-covered rocks, and the ground was soft underfoot. I saw deer tracks in the mud and the occasional squirrel darting through the branches. I carried a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and a map I had printed before coming. The map wasn't very detailed, but showed the main paths and a few landmarks, including an old logging road not far from the cabin. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Old, rusted metal objects half buried in the dirt. Fragments of wire, parts of machinery, and broken glass. It looked like someone had been here years ago, maybe for logging or mining. The forest was reclaiming it all, but the signs of human activity were faint but there. After a couple of hours, I reached a clearing with an old foundation made of large stones, maybe the remains of a cabin or small building. The wood was long gone, but nails and bits of broken glass were scattered around. I walked through carefully, noticing how the area was overgrown with weeds and vines. The silence here was heavier, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't stay long and headed back before the sun got too low. When I got back to the cabin, the fog had returned, thicker than before. The woods looked darker, the trees more like black shadows. I lit the stove again and tried to relax with a book, but my thoughts kept drifting. That night, I heard something outside. It wasn't the usual forest noises. It was a faint, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled over the ground. It was slow and deliberate. I stayed still, listening, but I couldn't see anything through the window except the dense fog. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and the forest went silent again. I told myself it was probably a fallen branch or an animal moving through the undergrowth. Still, it made me a little uneasy. The next morning, I found marks outside near the edge of the clearing. Deep grooves in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged across the ground. They led into the forest, disappearing between the trees. The grooves were fresh, the earth was still loose. I spent the day checking the perimeter, but I didn't see any other signs. The forest was quiet, and the cabin looked the same, but the feeling of being watched was growing. I kept the windows closed tight and kept a small hatchet near the door. The third night was worse. The dragging sound returned, louder this time, closer. It circled the cabin slowly, stopping sometimes, then moving again. I didn't dare open the door or look outside. I stayed huddled near the stove, the hatchet in my hand, the cabin dark except for the small orange glow. At one point, the dragging stopped just outside the door. I could hear heavy breathing, low and slow. My heart pounded. After a long silence, the sound moved away, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I noticed the back door had a long scratch mark, like claws trying to tear through the wood. The scratches were deep, jagged, and fresh. There was dirt and some hair stuck in the marks, coarse, dark, not human. Fear hit me hard, but I stayed calm. I knew the cabin was isolated, but it had a door and windows. I checked my supplies and decided I needed to get out the next day. That afternoon, I made sure the car was ready, packed everything, and prepared for the drive back. I wanted to leave before nightfall. As evening came, the fog was almost thick enough to cut with a knife. The sounds outside were different now, low growls, rustling that was faster and more purposeful. I sat near the window, watching the dark forest, waiting for the last light. Then I heard it, a deep growl, low and long, coming from just beyond the porch. I grabbed the hatchet and slowly stepped outside, the cold air biting my skin. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the mist. Suddenly, movement caught my eye, two glowing eyes staring at me from the edge of the clearing. The creature was large, much bigger than any dog or wolf I had seen. Its fur was matted, dark, and wet, and its teeth glinted in the dim light. I backed toward the cabin, heart racing. The animal didn't move but growled again, low and threatening. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I could hear it pacing outside, its heavy breathing and low growls pressing against the wood. I turned on the porch light, hoping to scare it away, but the creature just stopped and stared, unmoved. Night fell fully, and the cabin felt like a small island in a sea of danger. I stayed by the window, watching the shadows move, ready to defend myself. Morning came with a thin, weak sun. The creature was gone, but outside the porch were deep paw prints, big and muddy. I wasted no time. I packed the last things, started the car, and drove away, not looking back. The road was long and winding, but the feeling of relief grew with every mile. The forest stayed behind me, dense and silent. When I got home, I called the rental company and told them about what happened. They said the area was known for a large population of wild bears, and sometimes one or two got bold enough to come near cabins. Looking back, I realized the dragging sounds, the scratches, the growls. It was a bear, maybe a big male, territorial and desperate for food before winter. It wasn't a ghost or a myth. It was nature, wild and real, and I had been lucky to get away safe. The experience taught me how quickly the wilderness could turn from peaceful to dangerous. I still think about that cabin, the quiet lake, and the foggy nights, but now I know respect for the forest means knowing what lives there. Not just in stories, but in real life. It was early October 1998 when I decided to escape the city for a week. I was 26 years old then, living alone in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. Work had been eating me alive, and the constant noise of the city, the cars, the people, the sirens, made my head feel like it was going to split open. I needed a break, something quiet, somewhere I could be alone with my thoughts, without interruptions. So, I found a cabin listed in a small local paper ad, tucked away near Mount Hood National Forest, about an hour and a half outside the city. The cabin was simple but sturdy, built decades ago by a man named James who had passed it down to a distant relative who was renting it out. It was a wooden structure with a stone chimney and a front porch big enough to sit on with a coffee mug and watch the trees sway. The owner said it was isolated. No neighbors within a mile or two. Perfect for getting away, they said. No distractions, no noise, just nature. I packed what I thought I would need: clothes, a few books, food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and my old camera. I left on a chilly Sunday morning, the sky overcast, the kind of gray that felt like it would pour rain any second. The drive was calm, the roads narrowing as I got closer to the forest. The air changed the moment I left the highway. Cooler, crisper, scented with pine and damp earth. When I finally turned off the last dirt road and pulled up to the cabin, it felt even more remote than I expected. Trees pressed in close on all sides, tall firs and oaks with leaves just starting to turn yellow and orange. The cabin's wood was weathered but solid, its windows dusty but intact. I opened the creaky door and stepped inside. Inside, the cabin was small, about 600 square feet, with one main room that served as kitchen, living, and dining area. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bedroom and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of mothballs and old wood. A rusty wood stove sat in the corner, its black pipe rising through the ceiling. There was a stack of firewood on the porch, ready for use. I set my things down and started to explore. The kitchen was basic: a small gas stove, a single sink, a wooden table with 2 chairs. The cupboards held some old pots and pans, a few canned goods left by previous renters, and a faded instruction sheet for the stove. The bedroom had a creaky bed with a thin mattress and heavy quilts folded on top. The bathroom was clean but basic, with no hot water unless the stove was lit. I made a fire in the stove to warm the place, watching the flames dance behind the glass door. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the occasional call of a crow broke the silence. I unpacked my camera and notebooks, planning to write, read, and relax. I wanted to live off the grid for a few days, maybe hike a bit, maybe just sit on the porch and watch the forest. The first day passed quietly. I woke early, brewed coffee on the stove, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was fresh, and the sky had cleared into a pale blue. The forest was alive with movement. Squirrels darting between branches, birds flitting from tree to tree. I put on hiking boots and headed down a narrow path behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The trail was soft underfoot with fallen leaves and pine needles. The forest was dense but not unwelcoming. I followed a small stream, watching water ripple over rocks, listening to the quiet sounds of the woods. I walked for a couple of hours, stopping occasionally to take pictures of moss-covered trees and mushrooms growing in damp shade. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin feeling tired but peaceful. I built another fire and cooked a simple meal. Beans warmed in a pot, some bread I had brought. As dusk settled, the forest darkened. The cabin's windows glowed softly from the firelight inside. The sounds of the forest at night were different. An owl hooting in the distance, twigs snapping under invisible feet, the wind sighing through the leaves. I went to bed early, tired from the day's walk. The bed creaked under me, and the quilts smelled faintly of wood smoke. I was just drifting off when I thought I heard a noise outside, like something scraping gently against the cabin's side. I sat up, heart pounding, but the moonlight through the window showed nothing. Maybe a branch, maybe a deer. Sleep came slow but eventually took me. The next day was similar. A hike, a fire, reading by the window. But late in the afternoon, while I was preparing to go out again, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the cabin, faint but fresh. They weren't mine, and they didn't look like animal prints. Human for sure, but small, like someone wearing light boots or sneakers. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The cabin was supposed to be isolated. No neighbors within miles. Who could be walking around here? I checked the windows and doors. Everything was locked and secure. I told myself it must be someone hiking nearby or maybe a hunter, but the thought didn't ease my nerves. I decided to stay inside that evening, keeping the fire going and the flashlight close. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. Shadows flickered against the walls. The silence outside was thick, oppressive. Around midnight, I woke again to a faint tapping on the porch roof. Just light taps, but deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight, threw on a jacket, and opened the door a crack. The porch was empty. No footprints, no animals. Only the dark woods staring back. I slammed the door shut and locked it, heart racing. I spent the rest of the night half awake, listening for any other sounds. The forest was alive with strange noises. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, something moving in the underbrush, but nothing visible. Morning came slowly. I decided to leave the cabin and head back to town that day. Something felt off, and I didn't want to spend another night there. I packed quickly and stepped outside to load my things into the car. The forest looked peaceful in daylight, but the footprints were still there, nearby the porch, leading into the trees. As I got in and started the engine, I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a figure standing between the trees watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. The drive back was tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the figure to appear on the road behind me. But nothing. When I finally reached the city, the noise, the lights, the crowds felt overwhelming but safe. Days later, I called the cabin's owner. They said no one else was renting the place that week. They hadn't heard of anyone living nearby. The cabin was supposed to be empty and quiet. I never went back. The memory of those footprints, that tapping, and the figure in the trees stayed with me. A reminder that some places, even when empty, aren't as alone as you think. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to spend a week alone in the woods. I was 28, tired of the noise and rush of city life in Seattle. I had found a small cabin for rent, tucked deep inside the Cascade Mountains, about 3 hours north from the city. The owner had described it as a quiet spot, off the grid, perfect for anyone wanting to escape. I wanted to disconnect, to breathe fresh air, and maybe do some fishing and hiking. I never thought the trip would turn into something I'd never forget, something that would haunt me for years. The cabin was a simple, old wooden structure. It sat near the edge of a dense forest, with a narrow dirt road leading to it. When I arrived late afternoon, the sun was already lowering, casting long shadows through the tall pine trees. The air smelled crisp and clean, with a hint of pine sap and earth. There was no cell phone signal, which was exactly what I wanted. The cabin had a small porch with a rocking chair, a stone chimney, and a woodpile stacked neatly by the side. Inside, the cabin was basic but cozy. There was a small kitchen with a wood stove, a table, and a couple of chairs. A tiny living room with a couch covered in old, faded fabric, a bookshelf with some old paperbacks, and a simple bed in the corner. The windows were thick and small, with curtains that had seen better days. Everything was dusty, but it smelled clean, like the cabin had been closed up for months. I unpacked my bags and lit a fire in the stove, enjoying the warmth spreading through the room. The first couple of days were peaceful. I went on hikes, fishing at the nearby stream, and just sat outside watching the forest move with the wind. At night, the woods were alive with the sounds of animals, birds, crickets, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. It was the silence I craved, only broken by nature's voice. On the third night, things started to feel different. I had gone to bed early, tired from a long day of walking. The fire in the stove was low, casting soft, flickering shadows on the wooden walls. I was just drifting off when I heard a noise outside, sharp and sudden, like a heavy branch snapping. I froze, heart pounding, listening. But after a minute, nothing else. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence again. I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound felt too close. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went out onto the porch. The night was cold, the stars bright overhead. I swept the light over the trees, the woodpile, the path. Nothing moved. No signs of anyone or anything. Still, I locked the door and went back inside, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The next day, I kept checking the surroundings more carefully. I noticed something odd. A few broken twigs on the path leading to the cabin, and some footprints in the mud. They weren't deer tracks. They looked like human footprints, small and shallow, as if someone had walked lightly. I followed them a bit, but they disappeared into the thick forest. That night, I heard the snapping sound again, louder this time, closer, and then something else, a low scrape like someone dragging a heavy bag or moving something on the ground. My stomach twisted. I stayed up most of the night, sitting by the fire, flashlight in hand, staring out the window. On the fourth day, I found more signs. The woodpile was disturbed. Logs shifted, some smaller sticks broken. Nothing was missing, but it was clear someone had been there. I told myself maybe it was some campers or hikers passing by, though the road was barely used. Still, the thought of strangers around made me uneasy. That afternoon, I went deeper into the woods than before. I wanted to see if I could spot any other cabins or signs of people nearby. After about 2 hours walking, I found an old, abandoned fire pit. Around it were bits of rusted cans and a smashed lantern. The place looked forgotten, but fresh footprints surrounded it, too. I could see from the tracks they were small, like the ones near the cabin. On the way back, I felt eyes on me. I kept looking behind at every rustle and shadow. I didn't run, but my pace quickened. When I finally saw the cabin's roof through the trees, relief washed over me. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me jump. I thought about leaving the next day, but the car was parked miles down the road, and the weather was turning cold. Couldn't just walk out. On the fifth day, the feeling of being watched got worse. I found something new that morning. A bundle of sticks, tied together with a piece of twine, placed neatly on the porch railing. It was weird, like a crude symbol or marker. I didn't touch it. I looked around, but no one was in sight. The day passed slowly. I stayed mostly inside, chopping firewood to keep warm, but every so often, I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see a figure. That night, I was almost certain I saw a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was quick, barely a flicker. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside onto the porch. The beam scanned the dark forest, stopping on a pair of eyes reflecting back at me from about 30 feet away. I froze. The eyes blinked once and vanished. My heart hammered, my hands shook. I slammed the door and locked it tight, pushing a chair against it for good measure. I sat down, trying to steady my breath. The rest of the night passed in restless silence. The next morning, I woke to find the door had been scratched. The wood was gouged in several places, deep enough to feel with my fingers. The scratches looked fresh, like a desperate attempt to get in. I didn't sleep all night. That day, I packed up everything. I wanted to leave immediately, but the car was still down the road. I tried the phone again, no signal. I considered hiking back, but the trail was rough and long. I decided to drive to the nearest ranger station, which was about 10 miles down a side road. I gathered my things, put on my coat, and carefully stepped outside. The air was cold and dry. As I moved around, I kept looking over my shoulder. I left the cabin quickly, locking the door as best I could. The dirt road was bumpy and winding, flanked by dense forest on both sides. I kept my eyes peeled, but saw nothing. After about 20 minutes, I reached the ranger station. It was small and quiet, with a single old truck parked outside. I knocked on the door and waited. When someone finally answered, I explained my situation as best I could. They listened carefully, and then told me there had been reports of poachers and trespassers in the area. People using the forest illegally for hunting and camping, sometimes threatening to anyone who caught them. I felt a mix of anger and relief. I wasn't alone in sensing something was wrong. They agreed to send a ranger with me back to the cabin to check the place. When we arrived, the ranger looked serious. We checked the cabin thoroughly. There were more signs of intrusion, footprints, disturbed firewood, and the tied stick bundle. The ranger explained it was probably a warning or some kind of mark from the trespassers to let others know the cabin was occupied or watched. I stayed with the ranger overnight in the cabin, and we took turns staying awake. The next day, they arranged for me to be escorted back to my car. Before leaving, I took one last look at the cabin. It sat quietly among the trees, peaceful in appearance but hiding something darker beneath. The experience left me shaken, but also wiser. Nature is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes, It's not the wild animals you need to fear. It's other people. I never went back to that cabin. I've heard the area has since been patrolled more often to keep trespassers away. But every time I think about that week, I remember the feeling of being watched in the dark, the scratches on the door, and the eyes glowing in the night. It taught me that safety isn't just about the place you're in, but the people around you. And sometimes, the scariest thing is the unknown presence just beyond the tree line, watching quietly and waiting. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was late October, 2019, and I had finally gotten some time off work to spend a week alone in the woods, away from the noise and stress of the city. I was 32 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, and I chose a small cabin deep in the Mount Hood National Forest. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a small wooden structure built decades ago, with a wood stove, a few old pieces of furniture, and a kitchen that barely worked. But it was perfect for what I needed: silence, isolation, and time to think. I arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple behind the towering pine trees. The air was crisp and smelled like wet earth and pine needles. The drive-in had been bumpy and long, gravel roads weaving through thick forest. I parked my old Subaru a little way from the cabin, near a trailhead that led to a small frozen creek. The ground was damp from an early snowfall that had melted in the afternoon sun, leaving patches of mud. The cabin sat on a slight rise, with a small porch that creaked underfoot. I unlocked the door with a metal key I'd picked up from the caretaker's place in the nearby town of Government Camp. The inside smelled of wood smoke and mustiness, the kind that comes from a place closed up during the summer. I flipped on the old overhead light, which flickered for a moment before steadying. The cabin had a single main room with a small kitchen area along one wall, a table covered with dust, and 2 rickety chairs. A narrow staircase led to a loft above where the bed was. I dropped my pack on the floor, pulled off my boots, and opened the windows to let in the cold air. Outside, the forest was already darkening, shadows growing longer between the trees. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, and the distant creak of branches swaying in the wind. That first night, I built a fire in the stove. The wood was dry enough, and soon the cabin was warm and filled with the smell of burning pine. I cooked some canned soup over the stove and ate quietly, feeling the calm settle over me. Outside, the wind picked up and whispered through the trees, but inside I felt safe and snug. I had brought a stack of books and planned to spend my days hiking the trails, reading by the fire, and simply being alone. For years, life had been busy and messy. Work deadlines, crowded city streets, noisy neighbors, and endless small problems. I needed this escape, this break from everything. The first few days passed quietly. I rose with the sun, the light slipping between the branches and hitting the cabin windows. I made breakfast on a small camping stove, bundled up in layers because the nights were cold. During the day, I wore my hiking boots and carried a backpack with water, a map, and a small first aid kit. I explored the forest trails, careful of the slippery ground and fallen leaves. One afternoon, while walking near the creek, I noticed something strange on the trail. A few feet off the path, partially covered in leaves and dirt, were footprints. They looked fresh, too fresh for any animal and definitely not mine. The prints were large, maybe a man's boots, but something about the shape seemed off. The edges were sharp and clear, as if someone had stepped there only minutes before. I froze for a moment, listening. The forest was quiet except for the water trickling in the creek and the wind in the trees. No voices, no footsteps, nothing else to tell me I was not alone. But that didn't feel right. I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived, and the nearest cabin was miles away. I traced the prints carefully. They followed the trail for a short distance before veering into the trees. I thought about calling someone on my phone, but I had little to no signal here. The cabin's landline didn't work either. The old wires probably cut during a storm. I felt a chill not from the cold but from uncertainty. Someone else was nearby, close enough to leave fresh footprints. But who? Why hadn't I seen or heard them? I tried to brush the feeling aside, telling myself it was probably a hunter or a ranger checking the trails. That night, I kept the fire burning longer, the orange glow pushing back the dark corners of the cabin. Every small noise outside made me tense. A branch snapping, the distant hoot of an owl, the low rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I checked the windows multiple times, expecting to see a figure standing just beyond the tree line. But there was nothing, just the dark forest. I didn't sleep well. Every time I dozed off, I'd wake to some noise or an uneasy feeling crawling over my skin. The wind howled harder as the night wore on, shaking the cabin's walls. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I looked, the porch was empty. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, watching. Morning brought no relief. The footprints were still there, outside the cabin door, pressed deep into the wet earth. Whoever had been here wasn't gone yet. I wanted to leave, but the road out was muddy and difficult, and my car was parked too far to reach quickly. Over the next days, the feeling of being watched never left me. I found more signs: broken branches near the trail, small piles of stones stacked oddly, as if someone was marking their path or leaving messages. I saw no one, but the signs were there, constant and growing. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, I heard a noise behind me. Twigs snapping, soft shuffling. I turned quickly but saw nothing but thick bushes and trees. The forest was alive with sound, but this was different, too deliberate. I gripped my axe tightly and moved toward the cabin, trying to keep calm. Back inside, I locked the door and barred the windows with whatever I could find. The cabin suddenly felt small and fragile, like a fragile shell against the vastness outside. I started to realize that I was not alone, and that whoever had been following me wasn't planning to reveal themselves easily. That night was the worst. Around midnight, the wind stopped completely, and an unnatural silence filled the forest. Then, from outside, came slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. The crunch of boots in dirt, the scraping of something against the wood siding. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, trying to make out any shapes through the thin curtains. The footsteps moved to the porch and stopped. A faint shadow passed under the window. I could almost see the outline of a person, standing still and watching. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would break my ribs. Minutes stretched like hours. Then the footsteps moved away, circling the cabin again, slower now, almost like the person was hesitating. Finally, they faded into the woods. The next morning, I found marks on the cabin door. Deep scratches and dents, like someone had tried to force it open. My blood ran cold. Whoever was out there wanted in. I packed my things quickly, deciding I couldn't stay another night. I didn't know who was out there or why, but I knew it wasn't safe. The idea of walking through the woods alone with that person nearby was terrifying. The drive back was tense. I kept the windows rolled up and doors locked, glancing nervously into the dark trees along the road. When I finally reached the town, the normal noise of traffic and people felt like a shield. I stopped at the local sheriff's office and reported what I had seen. The sheriff listened carefully, taking notes. He told me that sometimes hunters or other people stayed hidden in the woods, but that no one had reported anything dangerous recently. Still, he promised to send someone out to check the area. A week later, I heard from the sheriff again. They had searched around the cabin and found signs of someone living rough in the woods nearby. An old campsite, some discarded food cans, a crude shelter made from branches and tarp. No one had been arrested, and the person had apparently moved on, but they had left behind trash and signs of their presence close to the cabin. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I wasn't dealing with anything supernatural or magical, just another human being trying to survive in the forest. But the fear of that unknown presence had stayed with me long after I left. I never went back to that cabin. Instead, I took trips to more populated campsites, where there were other people around and the chances of encountering someone unknown were smaller. The forest is beautiful, but it's also wild and unpredictable. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're other people, and the quiet, empty spaces where they can hide and watch without being seen. That week in the cabin taught me that safety is never guaranteed, and sometimes you have to listen to your gut and get out before things get worse. I never thought a quiet weekend away would turn into something I'd never forget. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to rent that cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 28 at the time, working in a small bookstore in Burlington, and I needed a break. A real break from the city noise and constant buzz of people. I'd been feeling worn down, tired like I was running on empty, and the idea of a few days with just silence and trees sounded perfect. The cabin was small, maybe 600 square feet, built decades earlier by a local family that had moved on. It stood at the edge of a clearing surrounded by thick pine and birch trees. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, and a porch where the paint peeled off in long strips. There was a stack of firewood neatly piled by the side and an old rusty wood stove inside. The floor creaked under every step, and the windows were covered with thin curtains that let in only soft, muted light. I arrived late in the afternoon, carrying a backpack with some clothes, canned food, a lantern, and a heavy wool blanket. I unlocked the door with the key the rental agency had given me, and the smell hit me right away. A mix of damp earth, old wood, and something else I couldn't name at first. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was thick and heavy in the air, like the cabin had been sealed up for a long time. I dropped my bag by the door and walked around the small living area. There was a kitchen nook with an old sink and a gas stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A small wooden table stood near the window, and the single bed was tucked in the corner, covered by a faded quilt. I opened the windows to let in the fresh air and sunshine, feeling the chill of the autumn wind on my skin as the cabin slowly warmed. Outside, the forest stretched on endlessly in all directions. The trees were in full color, yellows, oranges, reds, with leaves crunching underfoot. I could see a narrow dirt road leading back to the main highway, but it was far enough that no cars passed by except for the occasional pickup truck that disappeared quickly. After unpacking, I stacked some wood into the stove and lit a fire. The smoke curled up the chimney, and the cabin began to glow with a soft warmth. I sat on the porch, wrapped in the blanket, watching the sun dip lower behind the trees. It was peaceful, just me, the forest, and the quiet. That night, after the fire burned low, I lay awake listening to the sounds outside, wind rustling through branches, the distant call of a night bird, and the occasional crack of a falling twig. I felt calm, more relaxed than I had in months. I drifted off to sleep with the window slightly open, letting the cool night air brush against my face. The next day, I planned to explore the area. I packed a small bag with water, some food, a pocket knife, and a map I'd printed from an online source. The woods were dense but beautiful, with trails winding around hills and small streams. I followed a path that led to an old abandoned logging site about 2 miles from the cabin. There were piles of rotting wood and rusty equipment half buried in moss and leaves. The ground was soft and damp, and the air smelled of pine and wet earth. I wandered further, moving quietly and carefully so I wouldn't disturb any animals. I saw a few deer tracks and some squirrels darting through the underbrush. The sun was high, and I felt good being out there, away from everything. But as the afternoon wore on, I realized I had lost track of time. The sun started to lower, and I decided to head back before it got dark. The walk back seemed longer. The trees looked different, the shadows deeper, and the path less clear. I slowed down, trying to remember landmarks, but the forest around me felt unfamiliar. I kept telling myself I was just tired and maybe a little distracted. By the time I reached the clearing near the cabin, the light was fading fast. I hurried inside, locked the door, and started a fire again. I was tired, cold, and a little shaken by how lost I'd felt. I ate a quick dinner of canned beans and crackers, then sat by the stove staring at the flames. That night was different. The wind picked up and howled around the cabin, making the walls creak and groan. I kept hearing noises, small thuds, scraping sounds against the outside walls, and something like footsteps on the porch. At first, I told myself it was just animals or the wind playing tricks, but the noises didn't stop. I got up and checked every window. All the curtains were still, the glass wasn't broken, and no footprints were in the dirt outside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I felt cold despite the fire. I tried to sleep but kept waking up every hour or so. Each time I heard a noise, my heart jumped. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. The next morning, I decided to explore the cabin's perimeter. Maybe the noises were from animals caught or stuck nearby. I took a flashlight and stepped outside. The ground was soft from rain the night before, and the leaves were wet. I circled the cabin slowly, shining the light into every corner and bush. I found nothing unusual, no footprints except my own, no signs of animals trapped or injured, no evidence of people nearby, just the quiet forest. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Later that day, I noticed my food supply was lighter than I'd left it. A can of beans was dented, some crackers were gone, and my water bottle had less water than I remembered. I searched the cabin carefully, looking for signs of anyone else inside, but found none. No footprints on the floor, no disturbed furniture, no clues at all. That night, the noises returned, louder and more persistent. Scratches on the wood, thuds, and once, a loud bang on the door. I stayed near the stove with a heavy cast iron pan in my hand, my heart pounding. I didn't open the door, just sat there waiting for dawn. At first light, I walked down the dirt road toward the highway, hoping to find help or at least some sign of civilization. The road was empty, and I didn't see any cars for a long time. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call anyone. As I walked, I thought about what was happening. The noises, the missing food. Maybe someone had been sneaking into the cabin without me knowing. But how? The windows were locked. The door was locked. Unless someone had a key. I didn't tell anyone where I was going when I left town. No one knew about the cabin except the rental agency. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if someone else was out here. Maybe a local who didn't like visitors. That afternoon, I returned to the cabin, exhausted and tense. I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it before leaving. Inside, I found signs of someone having been there. Footprints in the dust, a small fire still warm in the stove, and a few of my things moved around. Panic hit me hard, but I stayed calm. I decided to prepare for the worst. I packed my bag with essentials and set a trap. A large rock tied to a string near the door, so I could tell if anyone came back while I was inside. The night that followed was the worst. The noises came earlier, louder, and with a clear rhythm. Scratching, banging, pacing back and forth. I stayed awake the whole night, holding the pan tightly, eyes wide open, listening. At one point, the rock outside the door shifted. My heart stopped. I held my breath, watching the door, but nothing else happened. Morning came, pale and gray. I took the opportunity to leave immediately. I walked down the dirt road without stopping, not looking back once. Eventually, I reached the highway and flagged down a passing car. The driver was an older man who took me into town and called the police. They sent a couple of officers out to check the cabin that day. They found no one inside, no footprints other than mine, and no clear evidence of trespassing. Just signs of an old campfire outside that looked recent, and some food scraps animals probably dragged away. I stayed in town for a few days trying to process what had happened. The police said it might have been a local who liked to scare off visitors, or maybe someone homeless living rough in the woods. Nothing was proven. I never went back to the cabin. I never even tried to, but the memory stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, the noises at night, the unlocked door in the morning. It wasn't something I could explain, but it was real enough to keep me from ever wanting to be alone in the woods again.